Hey guys, tonight we are heading deep into the woods, past the village well, past the dung heap, and right into the most neglected corner of medieval life, the toilet. Or, more accurately, the terrifying absence of toilet paper. Imagine waking up in a drafty stone hut, slipping on your wooden clogs, and trundling out into the morning mist with a full bladder and a heavier concern. What exactly are you supposed to wipe with? Spoiler, you probably won't survive this era with your dignity intact, because while castles had knights and troubadours, and peasants had fields and livestock, nobody had Charmin Ultra Soft. Yet somehow, people got by. Moss, straw, left hands, maybe even communal cloths hanging from nails. Medieval hygiene was a wild blend of practicality, superstition, and sheer necessity. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And as always, drop your location and local time in the comments. I love knowing where in the world you're listening from. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You shuffle along a muddy footpath, passing chickens and a pair of sleepy oxen. It's early, the air smells like damp hay and wood smoke. Your village is just waking up, but nature is calling, and in the year 1327, ignoring her isn't an option. You head toward the privy, or maybe just a bush. If you're lucky, or noble, you might have access to a wooden outhouse, or even a guardrobe, a small stone room built into a castle wall, projecting over a pit or river. But for most people it's open ground, behind a hedge, or down a path that leads to a shallow trench dug by hand. And once the deed is done, what next? You glance around, no paper, no leaves within reach. Maybe you pick up a smooth stone, maybe a handful of moss if the season's right. Maybe you settle for a fistful of straw, or yes, use your left hand and rinse with water later. No judgment. Everyone's doing their best here. Wiping was not just a private act, it was a practical one, and it had to adapt to whatever was available. While modern bathrooms give us a sense of control and cleanliness, medieval people worked with a rotating cast of natural options and varying degrees of discomfort. In England and across northern Europe, moss was a common favourite, soft, absorbent, and relatively plentiful in the damp woods. Travellers often noted how peasants carried bundles of it, tucked under their cloaks or tucked behind doors. Some even tied it into little rolls or bound it with twine like a poor man's loofah. But moss came with its own problems. It had to be dry enough to use and not riddled with bugs. And in winter, forget it. Frozen moss is about as friendly as a snowball made of sandpaper. Straw, meanwhile, was nearly universal. Found in every barn, stable and bedding pile, it made for a decent, if scratchy, substitute. But it also carried risks, fleas, splinters, and the occasional unpleasant surprise. There's a 14th century tale of a young farmhand who wiped with a bundle of straw, only to discover a dead mouse tucked inside. He allegedly screamed loud enough to wake the entire village. The mouse didn't comment. Then there were stones, smooth ones from riverbeds ideally, and not the jagged kind you'd use for sharpening tools. Archaeological digs in former latrine sites have uncovered such toilet stones, worn smooth by years of unfortunate use. Historians still argue whether these stones were commonly used across Europe, or mostly in specific regions like the Scottish Highlands or Scandinavia. But one thing is clear, if you were wiping with a rock, you had entered survival mode. And that brings us to the most controversial method of all, the hand. Yes, you've heard the rumours, and in some places, they were true. In areas without access to wipes or water, people, especially in the Islamic world, and parts of southern Europe and the Middle East, resorted to wiping with the left hand, which was then thoroughly washed, often using water from a jug or ladle. In fact, Islamic hygiene practices were far ahead of much of medieval Christendom in terms of post-defecation cleanliness. The Quran and Hadiths emphasize the importance of washing after using the latrine, and tools like the estinga, a washing stone or water pot, were common. In contrast, many Christian Europeans considered water near the backside suspicious, an entry point for disease or evil spirits. Some monastic rules even discouraged bathing altogether. It's not that they didn't want to be clean, they just thought dryness equaled purity. Moisture was dangerous. Water carried humours, and humours, those mysterious fluids believed to govern the body, had to be balanced, not provoked. So what did people think about wiping exactly? Well, not much was written explicitly about it. Most records focus on latrine construction, not the cleanup process. But from the clues we do have, it's clear that wiping was treated as a practical necessity, not a social conversation topic. The average peasant probably didn't have a designated wiping cloth or a cleaning stick, just whatever nature provided that day. And yet, some wealthier households kept dedicated rags or cloth scraps by the chamber pot. These were laundered, or sometimes burned, depending on how squeamish the household was and how many servants they had. And then there were the communal cloths. In some public latrines, especially in monasteries or large urban bathhouses, it was common to find a shared wiping device. Sometimes this was a cloth fixed to a stick, dipped in water and hung between uses. Sometimes it was a rag suspended on a nail in the wall, or a rope soaked in brine, dragged between the legs and rinsed afterward. No, it wasn't hygienic by modern standards. But when dozens of people used the same privy, options were limited. One monastery in 13th century France kept a roster of latrine maintenance duties, including the inspection of wiping cloths. The monk in charge reportedly complained of unruly wiping and improper folding. Monastic drama, it seems, extended even to the rear end. But here's the kicker. Despite all the weirdness, medieval people were often more aware of hygiene than we give them credit for. They knew bad smells meant illness. They feared miasmas, foul airs thought to carry disease. They recognised that excrement, if left unburied or unmanaged, caused problems. Latrine pits were moved regularly. Chamber pots were emptied by designated workers. And wiping, whether by hand, moss or miracle, was part of that broader effort to stay healthy, or at least not offend the neighbours. Still, you can't help but feel sorry for the medieval backside. Constant chafing, damp winters, a total lack of aloe. You sigh, step away from the imaginary bush and glance at the humble moss bundle tucked in your palm. You survive the deed, but as you shuffle back to your hut, the real danger begins, finding a place to wash up, without anyone noticing your wiping hand. Good luck with that. You wake up the next day with the sun rising through a cloud of wood smoke, and your thighs still sore from yesterday's crouch. The medieval world doesn't pause just because your wiping experience was subpar. Life goes on. There are sheep to herd, bread to bake, taxes to dodge, and more. Well, wiping to be done. Because when there's no modern plumbing, nature's call isn't just a personal issue, it's everyone's issue. Which brings us to the joy, the spectacle, the community event you never knew you never wanted. The communal outhouse. Yes, that's right. In medieval towns, monasteries, castles, and even some rural communities, going to the bathroom wasn't always a solo activity. In fact, it was often built around shared infrastructure. You didn't always have privacy, but you did have a hole in the ground with a little architectural flair. Let's picture it together. You head out of your thatched roof cottage and make your way toward the edge of the town square, where the public latrine sits. It's a small timber-framed structure with a thatched or wooden roof, a bench inside, and a line of holes, like a piano keyboard of bodily functions. There's no divider, no door, no lock, and if you're in a wealthier town, it might even be built over a running stream to carry the waste away. Romantic? Not quite. Functional? Surprisingly, yes. These early multi-seaters, used by monks, townspeople and castle dwellers alike, allowed several people to do their business at once. And while that might sound horrifying to a modern listener, it came with a certain pragmatic charm. First, it was efficient. In monasteries, time was scheduled down to the hour, and monks used the facilities in silence, often side by side. In fact, some monastic orders built long stone latrine chambers, complete with water channels underneath, designed to carry everything away through the use of gravity. Some even had ventilation shafts and rudimentary flush systems involving diverted river water. Pretty clever for a bunch of guys who wore robes and didn't believe in deodorant. Second, communal use meant maintenance was centralized. Someone, usually a servant or a lower-ranking monk, was in charge of cleaning. And while this job was considered lowly, it was vital. Pit latrines had to be emptied periodically, the walls scrubbed and the benches repaired. One broken seat, and suddenly you were the punchline of every tavern joke for weeks. And third, perhaps most unexpectedly, communal outhouses normalised the act. Yes, it was still private in a certain sense. People kept their eyes down, minds quiet. But in an era before the invention of bathroom shame, using the toilet wasn't considered embarrassing. It was natural, inevitable, and very much part of daily life. Just another stop on your way to the blacksmith or the market or the chapel. That said, not all communal privies were created equal. In larger cities like London or Paris, public latrines could be found near bridges, marketplaces, or even tucked into the sides of defensive walls. Some were free to use, others charged a small fee. These were often built over rivers, allowing waste to fall directly into the current, solving the problem of disposal and, unfortunately, creating several others downstream, quite literally. Imagine it. You're relieving yourself over the Thames, and someone upstream just dropped the contents of an entire tenement's chamber pots. Not exactly a spa day. Historians still argue whether these riverside privies improved sanitation or simply relocated the problem. Some claim they reduced disease in crowded areas, others argue they spread it further through the water system. What's certain is that by the 14th century, city authorities were issuing regulations about where privies could be placed, and fining those who dumped waste directly into communal streets and alleys. But here's a delightful detail. Some medieval urban outhouses came with graffiti. Yes, in between handling their business, some users took the opportunity to scrawl jokes, political insults, or love notes on the walls. Archaeological studies of latrine sites have uncovered scratched-in messages like, "Thomas was here," or "Beware the fart of Geoffrey." One monk in 1293 etched a tiny drawing of a devil poking someone in the rear, presumably to warn against lingering too long. And let's not forget about castle latrines, also known as guardrobes. These were small stone protrusions built into castle walls, usually high up, allowing waste to drop straight down into a moat or pit below. They were typically accessed from bedrooms or corridors, offering a bit more privacy than the public version. Still, privacy is relative. Some guardrobes opened onto shared shafts, some had no doors at all, and remember, moats weren't just for defence, they were toilets. So the next time you watch a knight galloping gallantly through a moat in a historical drama, just remember, he's riding through raw sewage, and his horse knows it. Castle servants were tasked with cleaning out the waste pits, often called cesspits, or gong pits. The unfortunate soul who did this was known as a gong farmer, and let's just say their job description involved a lot of shovels, strong stomachs, and no hope of marriage. Still, some castles took pride in their latrine tech. Harlech Castle in Wales had an impressive system of stone chutes and drains that led waste away from key areas. Dover Castle had guardrobes with built-in air vents, and in the most luxurious estates, the latrine might be lined with wood and covered with cloth, offering just a hint of dignity as you did your undignified deed. But even in these high-end bathrooms, wiping materials varied. Moss was still popular, especially dried and crumbled into bowls near the seat. Sometimes, a small wooden stick with a cloth tip was used, a precursor to the sponge on a stick method we'll explore soon. And in the cold months, warm water was occasionally poured down the chute afterward, to keep things, shall we say, flowing. Yet for all these options, one thing was consistent. You shared your bathroom space. Whether in a city square, a monastery corridor, or a castle wall, the toilet was a place of encounter, exchange, and occasionally competition. There's a recorded complaint from a baker's apprentice in 1431 who wrote, "I was set to the task, but the smith's boy lingered in the seat beside me. He made sport with farts and laughter. Some things never change, so as you squat beside your neighbour on a cold stone bench, the distant echo of a lute somewhere in the background, you begin to realise something profound. Hygiene might be personal, but in the Middle Ages pooping was public, and you, brave listener, are officially part of the most unglamorous guild in town. You've become a regular now. Every morning you shuffle out to your designated spot, whether it's a creaky wooden outhouse, a stone bench over a pit, or a trail worn into the woods behind your cottage. And each time, your biggest concern is no longer where to go, it's what to use after. Welcome to the wide, scratchy world of medieval wiping materials, because in a time before manufactured softness, comfort came down to creativity, courage, and just a bit of seasonal luck. Let's start with the MVP, moss. If you're in a damp region, say the British Isles, you're spoiled for choice. Moss was soft, absorbent, and grew nearly everywhere. Woodland areas offered thick carpets of it beneath trees, perfect for harvesting. And it wasn't uncommon for people to keep dried moss bundles in baskets inside their homes, ready for wiping when nature called. You reach down, pluck a handful and, oh, it's cold, and possibly damp, but still better than nothing. Some people would roll it up or compress it into small pads, even tying it with twine. It could be reused once or twice, especially if you rinsed it out and left it to dry in the sun. It wasn't glamorous, but it worked. Moss was so widely used that it shows up in various folk sayings and hygiene guides. In some regions, it was even associated with health beliefs. Some believed that moss from a north-facing rock was especially purifying, while others claimed that using moss without blessing it first could invite impish spirits. Historians still argue whether moss was the dominant wiping method for the lower classes, or simply one of many region-specific solutions. But suppose moss is out of season. Say, winter has rolled in like an icy plague doctor with no bedside manner. Now what? Enter straw. Straw was plentiful, especially in agricultural communities. You'd find it lining beds, floors, and animal pens. It made sense to grab a handful and head behind the stable for some scratchy relief. Straw wasn't exactly gentle, but it had one advantage: availability. It could be bundled, twisted, or woven into a sort of crude brush. One common setup involved 3 or 4 straws tied into a knot at one end, forming a kind of multi-pronged poke stick. It was not elegant, but again, it worked. People sometimes warmed straw near the fire before use in cold months. There are even reports of folk placing pre-bundled straw beside their chamber pots like little golden napkins of doom. Whether you burned it afterward or threw it in the dung heap, it was a one-and-done deal. Now, if you were feeling particularly eco-conscious, or more likely desperate, you might opt for leaves. Broad, soft leaves like those from mullein or lamb's ear were among the best. In fact, some of these plants earned the nickname nature's toilet paper, long before anyone thought to roll up cellulose in perforated sheets. You step into the woods, kneel down and search the underbrush. The key here is texture. You don't want brittle leaves that'll crumble mid-wipe, and you really don't want stinging nettles. Yes, that happened. No, they did not enjoy it. One peasant journal from the 14th century mentions a neighbour who mistakenly used a clump of thistle and howled like a devil at dawn. It became a local joke for weeks, but again, this all depended on location. In Mediterranean climates, olive leaves were surprisingly common. In forested areas, birch bark, peeled into thin strips and softened, made a kind of wooden wipe, durable, if a bit aggressive. You imagine a medieval man wincing as he scrapes clean, muttering, it's fine," through gritted teeth. And sometimes the truly desperate turned to cloth scraps. These were usually torn from old clothing, worn-out linen undergarments, discarded tunics, or rag towels. In wealthier households, these might even be designated latrine rags, rinsed and reused. In poorer homes, you simply cut up whatever you had. One surviving household inventory from 1426 mentions cloths for wiping of the posterior, listed under domestic necessities, sandwiched between firewood and soap. And what about sticks? Ah yes, the infamous wiping stick, a smooth wooden implement used to reach and scrape. These were common in regions where foliage was scarce and were often kept outside near latrine pits. Some were even carved with personal marks, so no one accidentally used someone else's wiping stick. Talk about awkward moments. Historians debate whether these sticks were used alone or in conjunction with moss or cloth, but some examples have been found in Viking latrine sites and early Saxon settlements, suggesting they weren't just folklore. And then there was wool. Yes, actual tufts of wool sheared from sheep, soft, fluffy, and absorbent. But only the rich could afford to waste wool this way. For most, it was simply too valuable. Using wool for hygiene was like washing your car with silk pyjamas. Doable, but absurd. Still, a few highborn individuals apparently did it. One countess in Burgundy was said to have a personal stash of lamb's wool for delicate cleansing, replenished weekly. It's unclear if this was fact, flattery, or just the medieval version of a luxury brand sponsorship. In monasteries, things were even more organised. Communal cloths were sometimes assigned to individuals and cleaned on a regular schedule. Monks had rules about how to wipe, when to dispose, and where to hang cloths afterward. And if Brother Thomas didn't follow protocol, well, the entire chapter house would know by morning. But let's not forget the mystery method, the one whispered about in dusty corners of manuscripts and folk tales, the sea sponge. Some claim that remnants of Roman toilet sponges on sticks, called tersoriums, persisted in remote medieval outposts, especially in bathhouses. Others argue these were long abandoned. Still, in some Mediterranean monasteries and port cities, washing devices resembling tersorium show up in illustrations. Did medieval people revive the Roman sponge? Did they pass down the knowledge of rinse and repeat hygiene? Historians still argue whether the tersorium method truly survived the collapse of the empire, or whether it was reinvented later. What's certain is that if you were a medieval person living in a wooden hut, you probably didn't have access to a communal sponge. You had moss, you had straw, you had your hand, you had options. And while none of them were scented, quilted, or marketed with bears doing a happy dance, they got the job done, mostly. So the next time you sigh with relief at your triple-ply paper, or complain about a public restroom running out of supplies, just remember, at least you're not rummaging through a pile of hay looking for the least pointy stalk. By now, you've bravely faced moss, wrangled straw, and regretted more than one encounter with scratchy leaves. But tonight, it's time to dive into what may be the most eyebrow-raising method of all, the infamous hand wipe. Yes, it's true. In many parts of the medieval world, and in fact across several eras and cultures, there were plenty of people who, when nature called, reached for nothing more than their own five-fingered solution. No moss, no sponge, no brush. Just hand, water, maybe a little soap if they were lucky, and a whole lot of technique. It's uncomfortable to imagine. But let's ease into it. Gently, cleanly. You crouch beside a bush in a quiet glen. It's early spring. The moss is still cold, and there's no decent straw in sight. You glance down at your hand. You hesitate. And then, with resignation and practiced precision, you take care of business. Just as millions before you did. Let's be clear. This wasn't a matter of laziness or ignorance. It was cultural. In fact, in certain parts of the world, particularly the Islamic Middle East, South Asia and North Africa, this method was paired with rigorous washing. Water was essential. The left hand was the designated hygiene hand. It was used for cleansing, but only for that. The right hand, reserved for eating, shaking hands, and more dignified duties. This cultural distinction continues to this day in many countries, and its roots go back centuries. Medieval Islamic societies in particular were remarkably advanced when it came to cleanliness. Religious texts emphasized cleanliness as part of spiritual purity. Ablutions before prayer, wudu, included washing hands, mouth, nostrils, arms, and feet 5 times a day. Post-defecation hygiene, known as istinja, involved washing with water using a small jug, ladle, or water pot. Some latrines in Islamic cities were equipped with special niches in the wall to hold water jugs. There are even archaeological examples of built-in drain channels designed specifically for this rinsing ritual. Imagine that. A stone toilet stall, centuries old, with plumbing for your posterior. In Europe, however, things were different. Christian medieval societies, particularly in Northern Europe, were less consistent about personal cleanliness. They feared moisture, associating it with disease and unbalanced humours. Bathing itself was often discouraged. So while some households may have used water, many relied on dry wiping materials instead, and some resorted to dry hand wiping, with water only coming into play afterward, if at all. Still, the practice existed. There are medieval texts that reference using one's hand and water as a form of cleansing, usually couched in awkward euphemisms. Monastic rules sometimes mentioned manual ablutions, and a few even advised using clean sand or ash if water was unavailable, almost like a proto-sanitizer. And yes, people knew which hand you were supposed to use. That's why the left hand became culturally stigmatized across much of Europe and the Middle East. Eating with your left hand, social death, offering someone your left hand in greeting, an insult. Left-handedness, more broadly, was seen as suspicious or even evil. Historians still argue whether this was entirely because of hygiene taboos, or if deeper superstitions about the sinister side played a role. But the connection between the left hand and toilet duty is unmistakable. Now imagine being a medieval lefty. Life was hard enough. Plagues, war, suspicious cheese. But now you're also accidentally offending people every time you pass a piece of bread. If you're lucky, you learn to switch hands. If not, you get called cursed, or worse, gross. In some places, people took these rules very seriously. An Arabic hygiene manual from the 10th century not only specifies using the left hand, but also warns against wiping with 3 or fewer fingers, because that was seen as insufficiently thorough. It even recommends washing the hand 3 times, minimum. Meanwhile, in some European peasant communities the method was more casual. You used your hand, then rinsed in a bucket or small stream nearby. There was no formal instruction, just passed down common sense and an unspoken agreement to never talk about it. But what if water wasn't available? Some resorted to ash or sand, especially in dry regions or during winters when water froze. These substances had an abrasive quality that helped with cleaning, and interestingly, some people believed they had purifying effects. In fact, ashes from the hearth were often used to clean cooking pots and hands alike. A 14th century French peasant diary, rare and oddly detailed, mentions keeping a small tin of ashes near the family latrine. "I scatter it after wiping," he writes, "for dryness and decency." Charming. Other times, people didn't clean immediately. They waited until they reached a water source, say a public fountain or washing trough, where they could rinse discreetly. This led to some very careful finger dipping and awkward hand washing techniques that you probably don't want to picture too clearly. But there were also rituals. In wealthier homes, a servant might bring a basin of water and a towel after you used the chamber pot. Some travellers carried small flasks of water for the purpose, and in certain regions clay or ceramic butt-washing jugs have been found. Vessels designed specifically for this intimate task. They had spouts, they had curves, they had purpose. One curious example from 13th century Andalusia features a water jug carved with little eyes and a smile. Was it whimsical? Was it an attempt to make an awkward process more tolerable? No one knows. But now you can imagine a world where your toilet tools judged you lovingly. Of course, none of this means the hand-only method was universally accepted. Even back then there were critics. Medical texts warned about rearward infections and lingering humours. Monks chastised one another for failing to rinse. Some church leaders believed the left-hand custom was evidence of Eastern excess, while others adopted it quietly because, well, it worked. And some people, no doubt, just didn't care. They did what they needed to do, wiped how they wiped, and got on with their day. They herded sheep, they baked bread, they sowed fields, and occasionally they scratched their noses and made everyone around them extremely nervous. So next time you're fretting over which brand of toilet paper has the softest quilting or most adorable bears on the packaging, take a moment to reflect. Your medieval counterpart had none of that, just grit, water, and a good memory for which hand to use, revised to 1400 plus words. You've grown braver now, accustomed to the creaky outhouse doors, the scent of straw warmed by a morning sun, and even the occasional mouse nestled somewhere you'd rather not think about. Your medieval self has become a seasoned veteran in the world of wipe or die improvisation. But just when you think you've seen it all, when moss and straw have become old friends, you stumble across a peculiar object in a quiet stone chamber. A long wooden stick, a sea sponge tied to one end, and a jar of vinegar beside it. Congratulations. You've just rediscovered a legend, the Tersorium, the ancient Roman sponge on a stick. At first glance, it looks like something you'd use to wash dishes or prod a lazy pig, but this, dear listener, is history's most infamous hygiene innovation, a simple tool that dared to ask, what if wiping didn't have to scrape and sting? What if it could swish? Now, the Tersorium is most famously associated with Roman bathhouses, where they were kept in jars of vinegar or salt water and shared, yes, shared, by multiple users. The system was simple. Do your business, rinse the sponge in the communal solution, clean yourself with it, rinse again, and leave it for the next lucky soul. It wasn't glamorous, but it was systematic and surprisingly effective, which raises the question, did this Roman relic survive into the medieval era? Historians are divided. Some argue the Tersorium vanished with the fall of Rome. Others point to scattered references, archaeological traces, and artistic clues suggesting the sponge on a stick quietly persisted, at least in parts of Europe and the Mediterranean where Roman influence lingered strongest. Imagine this. You push open the heavy wooden door of a 12th century bathhouse in southern Italy. Sunlight filters through a high window, catching on steam rising from a stone pool. Along one side of the room, latrines line a wall. Smooth stone seats, each with a water channel running underneath. And there, tucked near a ceramic pot, is the unmistakable shape. A long handle with something soft and vaguely ominous tied to the end. It's not a hallucination, it's a hygiene solution. In regions like Islamic Spain, southern France, or even parts of the Byzantine Empire, bath culture remained stronger than in the colder, war-torn parts of northern Europe. And where people bathed, they often maintained more sophisticated toilet practices. It wasn't a giant leap to imagine a sponge stick still in use. Some bathhouses and monasteries are even recorded to have had cleaning wands or wiping implements, described vaguely but with just enough specificity to make you suspicious. A 13th century monastic inventory from Al-Andalus lists 6 cloth-tipped rods for cleansing and a jar of perfumed vinegar. Sounds an awful lot like a Tersorium's descendant, doesn't it? And it wasn't just public bathhouses. Some private homes, particularly among the upper class, might have had their own wiping tools, personal Tersoria, if you will. These would have been made of carved wood, polished and smooth, and affixed with cloth or sponge material. Some were even decorated, wrapped with ribbon, or fitted with ivory handles. It may sound odd now, but in an age when almost everything was reused and repurposed, the idea of a reusable wipe wasn't so absurd. You can almost picture it. A baroness reclining after a long meal, waving a servant toward the garderobe. The servant sets down a tray with a jug of warm water, a soft cloth, and the household's prized cleaning stick. It's been rinsed with rosemary water. It has a name, Perhaps Clarence. Laugh all you want. But in a world without quilted triple ply or bidets with adjustable pressure, Clarence was probably the height of luxury. Of course, shared use was more common in public or communal settings. That meant hygiene had to be maintained, at least as much as 12th century sanitation allowed. Buckets of vinegar or salt water were used for rinsing. The sponges might be swapped out weekly. In some wealthier bathhouses, there was even an attendant whose job was to maintain the sponge rotation. Think about that for a moment. You're the medieval version of a towel boy, but for sponges. You clock in, you count the sticks, you inspect the vinegar, you make sure Clarence and his cousins are ready for the daily parade of noble backsides. Not exactly a dream career, but someone had to do it. Still, the idea of shared hygiene tools didn't sit well with everyone. As Christianity spread through Europe and public bathing declined, the emphasis shifted away from communal cleanliness and toward individual modesty. Many theologians began to associate shared bathing, and by extension, shared wiping, with moral decay. Bathhouses were seen as dens of temptation, and tools like the tessorium were quietly retired or repurposed. But remnants of the method lingered. Some rural households kept wiping sticks, smaller versions of the sponge on a stick, fashioned from carved wood with a cloth scrap tied at one end. These were rinsed after use and hung near the latrine. Some were even labelled or painted to prevent mix-ups. Because let's be honest, that's a mix-up you don't recover from. In certain Mediterranean cultures, people used handheld scoops or curved spatulas, not unlike a modern-day back-scratcher, to assist with wiping or washing. These too may have evolved from the Roman sponge tool. Some had notched handles, others were made of horn or bone. Always they were rinsed after use, often with water perfumed with herbs like thyme, sage or lavender. And the idea of post-defecation washing didn't disappear either. Even when the sponge itself vanished, the logic behind it, wet is better than dry, remained in places like the Islamic world, India, and parts of the Mediterranean. In these regions, rinsing with water was not only cleaner, but also spiritually preferable. Religious texts encouraged cleanliness, and tools like lotta jugs or pitchers became standard household items. Meanwhile, Northern Europe remained committed to dry wiping with moss, straw, cloth, or just your hand and a prayer. It wasn't until centuries later that paper began to appear, and even then, it took time to replace these older methods. Historians still argue whether the tessorium truly endured into the medieval period, or if these later tools simply emerged independently, echoing the same logic. But the similarities are too striking to ignore. The sponge on a stick may not have appeared in every village, but its idea did. Wipe, rinse, repeat. And try not to drop the stick in the bucket. Even artwork gives us hints. A marginalia sketch from a 14th century manuscript shows a monk being chased by what looks like a sponge on a pole dripping ominously. It's labelled only the Wand of Woe. Was it a joke, a punishment, or just a hygiene doodle that went off the rails? We'll never know. But it tells us this much. Medieval people thought about wiping tools. They lived with them, and yes, they laughed about them. So tonight, as you picture your medieval self crouched in a stone latrine, a vinegar-soaked sponge in one hand and a very strong sense of humility in the other, take a moment to appreciate the innovation behind it all. They didn't have toilet paper, they didn't have plumbing. But they had creativity, resilience, and a deep, undeniable urge to leave the privy feeling at least a little fresher than before. And maybe, just maybe, they had Clarence. You've rinsed, you've wiped, you've met Clarence the communal sponge and lived to tell the tale. But tonight, we take a detour from shared tools and cold stone latrines into a realm reserved for the lucky few. The medieval elite, the landowning lords, the abbots and duchesses whose rears were blessed with running water. Yes, it existed. And no, it wasn't quite plumbing as you know it. You awaken inside a stone manor house, where the walls are thick, the fire is low, and the bedchamber has its own private garderobe. A small, narrow latrine chamber tucked into the thickness of the castle wall, often perched over a pit, moat, or cliffside drop. The real luxury? Some of these were rigged with a clever trickle of running water flowing underneath, washing waste away to some distant, unseen place. These weren't exactly flush toilets, but for the time, they were astonishingly modern. And when your estate has its own stream redirected through a gravity-fed channel carved into stone, you don't just sit and squat, you do so in style. And that's where our elite toilet tale begins. Take Langley Castle in Northumberland, England. Built in the 14th century, it featured multiple garderobes that emptied straight into a stream below. The rushing water did the dirty work, flushing waste away and keeping smells to a minimum. And Langley was far from alone. Castles across Wales, Scotland and France adopted similar designs. Some even included garderobe towers, with vertical shafts descending several stories. One particularly clever example, Chateau Gaillard, a 12th century fortress in Normandy, had a latrine built over a crevice in the rock that led to a sheer cliff drop. Gravity was king, maintenance was minimal, and if you're lucky, the wind carried the scent far, far away from your breakfast table. But these were more than architectural conveniences, they were status symbols. Having a private garderobe implied wealth. Having multiple garderobes, that was pure flex. Some castles assigned specific garderobes to specific family members. Others had garderobes connected directly to bedrooms or hallways, tucked discreetly behind tapestries or narrow doors. It wasn't uncommon for noble women to have personal chambermaids assist them, not just with clothing, but with their daily hygiene, including wiping and washing. Yes, someone else might wipe for you. The role of the gong page or close maid was rarely written about in glowing terms, but it was considered a job of trust. If you were wealthy enough, you never lifted a moss clump in your life. Instead, you were dabbed, rinsed, powdered, and redressed by someone whose entire job was to deal with your dignity, discreetly. But not all castle latrines emptied into thin air. Some led to cesspits, which had to be cleaned out regularly. This was the realm of the gong farmer, the medieval sanitation worker. Gong farmers were often paid better than other labourers, but their job came with a serious stink, both literal and social. No one wanted to live near them. No one invited them to dinner, but they were essential. And sometimes the cesspits backed up. One infamous example, in 1183 a German king's banquet ended abruptly when the castle latrines overflowed due to rain flooding the drainage system. The great hall filled with an aroma best left undescribed. Several guests reportedly fled mid-course. One chronicler noted that the king retired with haste, his dignity trailing. It's not clear whether trailing was metaphorical. Still, for all the drawbacks, castles tried to improve comfort. Some garderobes were lined with wood or padded with cloth to soften the seat. Others had aromatic herbs scattered beneath them, lavender, sage, or even pine needles to combat smell. It wasn't plumbing, but it was thoughtful, and where there was water, there was washing. In castles with access to streams, a small jug of water might be kept in the garderobe chamber, resting on a ledge or hook, sometimes a cloth, sometimes even a ceramic basin collecting runoff from a nearby channel. If you were noble and inclined toward cleanliness, you might rinse after wiping, using warmed water scented with rose or chamomile. One account from 1354 describes a duchess who insisted on rosewater rinsing after every chamber visit. Her maids would bring a silver ewer and matching bowl, her chamber pot gilded, her cloths embroidered. She even had her own perfume to dab under her nose to mask the odours. A medieval spa day, if you will. But the most elaborate system of all? Monasteries. Certain abbeys built advanced garderobe systems rivaling castles. Take Fountains Abbey in Yorkshire. Its latrines emptied into a channel of diverted river water, constantly flowing beneath the stone seats. This wasn't just waste disposal. It was water management, architectural elegance, and spiritual purity combined. Monks were meticulous about hygiene, at least within the constraints of their theology. Cleanliness was seen as next to godliness, but not always for physical reasons. Bodily filth was a reminder of sin and humility. Bathing too much was frowned upon, but wiping thoroughly. That was simply obedience. In some monasteries, latrine schedules were posted. Specific times of day were set aside for private matters. Silence was required. Some even had rules about how many cloths to use, or how many rinses were sufficient. Still, historians debate whether these water systems were as common as romanticised. Many monastic garderobes probably emptied into static pits or required manual bucket flushing. But when they worked beautifully. Even travellers were occasionally blessed with running water if they stayed in high-end inns. Yes, medieval inns sometimes had private rooms with connected latrines, especially in cities like Paris, Florence, or Constantinople. These might include a chamber pot beneath a bench or a toilet seat built over a shaft. Some even had gravity-fed rinse systems pulling rainwater through clay pipes to assist with flushing. One Venetian merchant, writing in 1422, boasted that his inn had a seat of marble with a channel of cold water forever running beneath. He called it a marvel for the rear. Perhaps history's first bathroom influencer, but even with water systems, the elite still relied on wiping tools. Fine cloths, lamb's wool, even embroidered handkerchiefs designated for toileting. These were used delicately and often disposed of or burned afterward. Wealth meant waste, and in the realm of hygiene, that waste was sometimes literal. So tonight, as you picture yourself sitting atop a stone bench in a tower latrine, a trickle of water murmuring far below, the scent of lavender wafting from a pouch at your waist, know this: medieval people, especially the wealthy, wanted to feel clean just as much as we do. They used what they had: water, servants, herbs, gravity, even architecture. And if you're lucky, Clarence the Sponge is nowhere in sight. You've had a taste of luxury. Stone garderobes, rosewater rinses, gravity-fed latrines humming beneath abbey floors. But now it's time to descend back into the world most medieval people called home. You're no longer a lord or a duchess with scented rinse basins. You're a baker's apprentice, or a blacksmith's wife, or just someone living in a modest timber-framed cottage with a leaky roof and no plumbing in sight. And when nature calls, you don't have a moat or a flowing stream beneath your posterior. You have a bucket. Enter the most widespread, unglamorous, unscented hero of medieval hygiene, the chamber pot. Found in nearly every household, from peasant hut to merchant home, this humble vessel was the workhorse of nighttime convenience. By day it was tucked under a bed or beside a stool. By night, especially on cold or stormy evenings, it was the toilet of choice. And wiping. That was where things got creative. In these households, there wasn't a designated bathroom space. The chamber pot might live near the hearth or sleep at your feet under a straw mattress. Everyone in the house, parents, grandparents, children, might use the same one. And in homes with no privacy at all, that meant sharing not just the pot but the rituals around it. You wake up before dawn, pull on a wool tunic and reach for the chamber pot. It's made of clay, maybe pewter if you're lucky, and it sloshes ominously as you adjust it. Afterward, you glance around for your wiping options. There's no soft stack of folded linen waiting for you. Just a rag, stiff from yesterday's use, or maybe a strip of old cloth tucked into a corner. If you're especially lucky, there might be a bucket of water next to it, a rinse station of sorts. But most often, you do your best with what's there: cloth, moss, straw, or just a quick wipe and a plan to wash up later at the village trough. This was the norm for millions. These cloths weren't decorative. They were torn from worn-out shifts, threadbare tunics, or old bedsheets. Once reduced to rags, they took on a second life, first as dishcloths, then perhaps floor mops, and finally as privy wipes. In many homes, these were kept in a small pile near the pot, used, rinsed, reused, until they were too frayed or stained to continue their service. And yes, people did their best to clean them. Buckets of lye water, ash soap, or even urine were used in the washing process. That's right, urine, with its ammonia content, doubled as a cleaning agent in medieval laundry practices. It was collected, stored, and sometimes sold. In fact, in parts of medieval Europe, entire professions revolved around collecting and repurposing human waste, especially for cleaning wool, whitening cloth, and yes, disinfecting rags. Historians still argue whether this was considered standard practice across regions or limited to urban centres where rags and urine were more plentiful. But in either case, wiping cloths weren't simply thrown away. They were washed, dried, and returned to duty. And let's not forget the rag stick, a wooden dowel with a cloth tied at the end. In many homes, this tool was used to wipe without getting your hands too involved. The cloth could be untied, washed, and replaced. Some families even carved names into the handles or marked them with coloured thread to distinguish whose was whose. Wiping, it turns out, was a deeply personal ritual, even when shared in the same cramped house. But this leads us to a larger, grimmer question. What happened when the chamber pot was full? Well, if you were organised, you'd empty it every morning, walking it out to a compost pile, a shallow pit, or a designated corner of the yard. Some people buried the waste with ashes or leaves. Others simply flung it into the street. Yes, you read that correctly. In towns and cities, chamber pots were emptied from upper-storey windows, often with a warning cry, "Gardez-loo" in Scotland or "Attention" in France, before the contents cascaded downward into the alley below. Streets became rivers of sludge, gutters clogged with muck, and city officials, especially by the 14th century, began issuing ordinances to regulate waste disposal. One London law from 1383 warned citizens against throwing filth into the King's Way, punishable by fine, or in extreme cases, a dunking in the river. It didn't always work. In fact, some medieval towns hired scavengers, men who travelled the streets at night with carts, collecting chamber pot waste and transporting it to dumping grounds outside the city walls. These men, often known as night soil men, worked under cover of darkness and often lived on the fringes of society. And yet, the system worked, in its own odorous, labour-intensive way. Back inside your cottage, wiping tools weren't just cloths and moss. Some homes kept small wooden paddles, flat spatula-like sticks with a leather or cloth square attached to the end. These were dipped in water, wiped and rinsed again. In winter, the rinse bucket sometimes froze overnight, leading to one of medieval life's lesser-known trials, the ice-cold butt bath. One German folktale even warns of a cursed chamber pot that froze solid during a snowstorm, trapping a poor peasant in place for hours until a neighbour rescued him with a kettle of broth. Was it satire? Perhaps. But it speaks to how intimately woven these tools were into daily life, hardship and humour. Even placement mattered. In some homes, the pot was kept behind a curtain or screen. In others, it lived under a bench or stool with a hole carved into the seat, a kind of proto-toilet known as a close stool. These could be simple wooden boxes, upholstered for comfort, and even lined with pewter or ceramic bowls for easy cleaning. Some versions were portable and used by wealthier families while travelling. There's a record of a noblewoman refusing to leave a pilgrimage without her personal close stool. It had embroidered cushions and a handle for carrying. She called it Hope. Meanwhile, in cities like Venice or Bruges, artisans sometimes crafted decorated chamber pots, glazed with whimsical designs or even portraits. One 15th century example features a painting of a grumpy bishop and the phrase, "better here than at prayer." Medieval humour had bite. So as you sit on your little wooden stool, feet braced on straw-covered planks, rag in hand, steam rising from the winter air around you, you realise this moment, though deeply private today, was once utterly commonplace. No one blushed about chamber pots. No one whispered about rags. It was a part of life, as mundane as milking a cow or sweeping the hearth. And that's what makes it fascinating. Because behind every castle feast, every market fair, every scribe hunched over a manuscript, there was someone somewhere hunched over a pot planning how to wipe with dignity. By now, you've handled more moss than a forest sprite, outwitted straw splinters in the moonlight, and endured the splashy politics of chamber pot etiquette. But for all your backside bravery, there's one thing you haven't quite faced yet: the strange and surprisingly widespread world of communal bathhouses, and the curious wiping customs that came with them. You're in a medieval town now, not a tiny hamlet, but a bustling borough with cobbled streets, shouting vendors, and the faint scent of meat pies and manure mingling in the air. Somewhere, a bell rings. Somewhere else, someone's dumping a chamber pot. But you're headed towards something much more elegant: a stewing bath. No, not a cauldron, a bathhouse. Public bathhouses were common across medieval Europe, especially in the 12th to 15th centuries, and particularly in larger towns and cities. These were places not just for washing, but for eating, gossiping, relaxing, even romancing. A medieval spa with wooden tubs, steam-filled chambers, and an entirely different relationship to personal hygiene. And yes, toilet habits were part of the experience. Let's start with the basics. Once inside, you'd pay a small fee. Men and women often bathed together, at least until church authorities got nervous, stripping down to linen shifts or nothing at all, depending on local custom. You'd soak in a large heated wooden tub, filled with water that may or may not have been changed recently, and enjoy wine, music, or bread with broth, served on trays that floated in the tub like tiny dinner rafts. Eventually, though, the inevitable happened, and when it did, bathhouses had options. Larger bathhouses featured latrines built into the corner of the stewing room or nearby changing area. These might be small wooden benches with holes, chamber pots beneath, or simple gutter systems flushed with water. In wealthier establishments, there were even designated wiping attendants. Yes, actual humans, whose job it was to assist with cleaning, especially for elderly or infirm guests. But in most cases, bathers were expected to clean themselves, and this is where the sponge, rag, or hand rinse method came in. You finish soaking, you step into the rinse area, where buckets of water and bundles of rags are stacked near a low bench. A cloth-wrapped stick, reminiscent of our old pal the Tursorium, waits in the corner. You pick it up, pour a ladle of warm water over yourself, and get to work. And no, this wasn't considered shameful. In fact, cleaning the rear was part of the expected ritual, especially in Islamic bathhouses, hammams, where purification after relieving oneself was not just customary, it was religiously encouraged. Even in Christian Europe, where cleanliness could be seen as morally ambiguous, bathhouse etiquette generally included some kind of washing after defecation. Historians still argue whether bathhouses in Christian Europe promoted better hygiene overall, or simply provided temporary relief from the grime of daily life. But the surviving records suggest that, at least during their golden age, they made cleanliness feel not just possible but enjoyable. And as for the wiping materials, well, these varied by region, class and season. In German bathhouses, you might find linen cloth soaking in scented water, lavender, mint, or even rosemary. In Italian cities like Florence, records mention the use of wool pads, stored in ceramic bowls beside the latrine stalls. In northern France, bathers often brought their own cloths, kept in small embroidered pouches alongside combs, soaps and oils. And of course, in Islamic bathhouses, the lotta, a small water vessel, was used for direct rinsing. This method, which remains widespread today, allowed for thorough cleaning without the use of cloths. You'd squat over a stone floor with a drainage channel, pour water with the right hand and rinse using the left. It was efficient, effective, and, despite your hesitation, actually pretty comfortable. But things weren't always squeaky clean. Many bathhouses were shared spaces for both the upper and lower classes. That meant high turnover, reused water, and not always the most careful sanitation. Some cities attempted to regulate them. In Paris, a 14th century ordinance required bathhouses to change their water at least once a day. In Nuremberg, officials posted hygiene warnings and fined bathers for improper soiling. Yes, someone had to enforce bathroom behaviour, and sometimes people didn't follow the rules. There's a notorious case from 1397 in which a bather in Prague was caught urinating in the bath water. He was banned for a year and forced to scrub the stewing tub with a rag soaked in vinegar, while the other patrons watched. Humiliation, medieval edition. Still, bathhouses persisted, and with them, the associated rituals of wiping and rinsing. For many, they were the cleanest part of life, but then came the decline. By the late 15th century, public bathhouses began to fall out of favour across much of Europe. Why? 3 reasons. First, the Black Death. People began to associate warm, damp environments with the spread of disease. Some believe that bathing opened the pores to bad humours or corrupted airs. Bathhouses, once seen as healthful, became suspicious. Second, moral panic. Clergy and conservative officials increasingly viewed mixed-gender bathing as immoral. Tales of scandalous behaviour in the stewing rooms, some exaggerated, some very real, led to closures or increased regulation. And third, the rise of linen. As cloth became cheaper, more people had access to fresh undergarments. Instead of bathing often, they simply changed their shirts more regularly. It was believed that clean linen absorbed dirt and sweat from the skin, acting as a sort of wearable bath. So the public bathhouse faded, and with it, the communal wiping rituals it supported. But echoes remained. Even centuries later, in rural parts of Europe, travelling bathers would carry personal hygiene kits, small bundles with a rag, a soap block, and sometimes a carved wiping stick, oiled and polished. These kits were passed down through families, used during long pilgrimages, or brought to market towns on wash days. And occasionally in quiet corners of libraries, scholars find marginalia, those cheeky little doodles drawn in the margins of medieval books, of bathers with sticks, or figures squatting beside tubs, wiping with exaggerated gestures and blissful smiles. Because apparently wiping was funny in the 1400s too. So tonight, as you towel off from your imaginary soak in a 14th century Parisian bathhouse, steam rising from your skin and rosemary-scented cloth in hand, remember this. There was a time when wiping was communal, cleaning was public, and nobody blinked twice about rinsing their rear in front of a stranger. And while it may sound shocking now for them, it was just another part of the daily cleanse. A moment of clarity, a ritual of relief. You've rinsed in rosemary-scented bathhouses, tossed chamber pots from second-floor windows, and made peace with sticks, moss, and questionable cloths. But now, dear traveller, it's time to look beyond the tools and buckets to the real battleground of medieval hygiene. The village path, the castle stairwell, the barnyard hedge. In short, anywhere that wasn't a designated toilet. Because as it turns out, most people just went wherever they could. Let's walk together. It's early morning. You step out of your cottage, past a few sleepy chickens and into the muddy lane. The cobblestones are slick with last night's rain, and something else. A few footprints, a smell that refuses to be subtle, and somewhere nearby, the telltale sound of someone relieving themselves in the hedgerow. Yes, the hedgerow. It's not glamorous, but it's everywhere. In medieval villages, the idea of indoor plumbing was as foreign as flying carpets. While castles had guardrobes and towns had public privies, most rural folk simply used the outdoors. Trees, ditches, bushes, fields. If it provided a little cover, it was fair game. In fact, some towns had designated dung heaps, not just for manure, but for human waste too. You'd walk to the edge of the village, do your business behind the brush, and toss a handful of straw or ash over it. The smell was permanent, but the routine was familiar and wiping. It came down to what was nearby. You crouch in the grass, scanning for anything dry and soft enough to serve. If it's summer, you're lucky. Leaves, moss, even smooth pebbles might do. In winter, well, hope you enjoy the feeling of bark, or worse, snow. Because yes, some sources suggest snow wiping was a thing, cold but surprisingly effective. One 15th century poem even jokes about a farmer who, cleans his tail with winter hail. Historians still argue whether that's poetic flair or literal truth, but honestly, does it matter? Either way, someone definitely tried it. And then, of course, there were barns. If you were working in the fields or tending animals, the barn became your bathroom. You'd find a quiet corner near the hay, pull your tunic aside and make quick work of it. Hay was scratchy but plentiful. So was sheep's wool, if you didn't mind getting some judgmental bleats during your moment of vulnerability. In some regions, animal stalls doubled as toilets, especially in winter. The animal's body heat kept the space warmer, and the straw bedding absorbed, well, everything. There's a note in a 14th century farming manual suggesting, "To void near the oxen is no shame, for the beasts care not." And in cities, let's just say the streets had character. Before proper sewer systems, waste disposal was largely DIY. That meant alleyways, gutters, and even stairwells became impromptu latrines. Some towns installed stone urinals in side alleys, called piss corners, to encourage men to relieve themselves in a consistent spot. But for women, options were fewer. Chamber pots helped, but when you had to go, you had to go. One Parisian ordinance from 1388 complained that the ladies do squat behind stalls of the market to the offence of the cheese sellers. And really, who could blame them? Public shaming wasn't uncommon. Some cities fined citizens for relieving themselves outside designated areas. But enforcement was inconsistent, and sanitation officers, often called rakers or wardens of the filth, were too few to keep up with demand. So people continued to go wherever was convenient. Behind a wall, beside a pig pen, into the river. Yes, the river. In towns with water access, the river served as everything. Bath, laundry basin, waste disposal, and yes, latrine. People squatted at the banks, rinsed chamber pots directly into the current, and hoped the flow carried everything away. Downstream users were less fortunate. Some city authorities tried to regulate this. In 1357, the City of London banned dumping waste into the Thames, on paper at least. But enforcement was spotty, and with few alternatives, the river remained both a lifeline and a latrine. Of course, not everyone embraced this freestyle bathroom culture. Monks and nuns, bound by rules of modesty, were often required to use designated latrines, even while travelling. Some monasteries had portable seats they carried with them, complete with waxed linen liners. Pilgrims on long journeys sometimes dug small holes beside the road, using sticks to mark the spot afterward, out of courtesy to those who followed. In fact, a few medieval guidebooks included polite tips for travellers' hygiene, suggesting to go not upon the footpath, nor where cattle eat. One even advised carrying cloth squares for wiping and wrapping them tightly afterward, until they may be cast far from the road. A medieval version of pack-in, pack-out. And let's not forget the castle wall trick. In some fortresses, waste chutes were carved into outer walls, allowing residents to relieve themselves directly into the moat or cliffside. But in moments of urgency, or during siege, when leaving your post meant risking your life, soldiers often relieved themselves into their helmets and tossed the contents over the battlement. A grim twist on reusing gear. There's even a documented case from the Siege of Antioch, 1098, where a knight reportedly used his mail coif as a latrine in desperation. He then, according to legend, offered it to the enemy as a form of psychological warfare. May your noses share in our suffering, the account reads. Inventive and disgusting. So what about etiquette? Well, there wasn't much. When you lived in a single-room house with your family, privacy was a luxury. People went when they needed to, where they could, and the focus was on efficiency, not elegance. Children were taught early to use the yard, the bush, the bucket. Elders might be assisted by family members, and nobody clutched their pearls when someone mentioned the word privy. Still, there were unwritten rules. Don't go near the bread oven, don't squat in the churchyard, don't relieve yourself near someone's well, or at least not again. And if you had to go in a public place, for heaven's sake, yell a warning. Wear below, was a common English shout when tossing waste out the window. In France, gardez-l'eau. In Scotland, ord your nose. Okay, that last one might be apocryphal. But all of this points to a central truth. Toilets weren't places, they were moments. A quiet spot behind a hedge, a corner of a stable, a stone step just far enough from the door. The act itself didn't need a structure. It needed a little time, a little cover, and just enough dignity to get you through the day. So, tonight, as you huddle in your hooded cloak under a crescent moon, seeking the least muddy patch behind a haystack, wiping with whatever the wind hasn't carried off, remember this. Medieval people weren't dirty, they were resourceful. And when the outhouse was full and the moss was wet and the chamber pot had already been flung once today, they still found a way to go. You've squatted behind hedges, dodged chamber pots raining from above, and even applauded knights who weaponized their own helmets. But now, let's settle into something even more mysterious, even more sacred, and as always, slightly awkward. The toilet habits of religious orders. Because if anyone was going to treat wiping like a ritual, it was the monks. Monasteries were oases of order in a chaotic world. They had rules for everything. When to pray, when to eat, when to speak, or more often not speak. And yes, when and how to relieve oneself. So it's no surprise that even going to the bathroom was governed by a quietly humming machine of spiritual cleanliness, social coordination, and, well, teamwork. You find yourself inside a Benedictine monastery, nestled in a foggy English valley. The stone corridors echo with soft footsteps and whispered Latin chants. The air smells faintly of beeswax and cabbage soup. And somewhere behind the cloister walls a dozen monks are lining up for the latrine, in silence, robes rustling like dry leaves. These weren't just any toilets. They were called rear daughters, from the Latin retro dormitorium. Behind the sleeping area. Built behind or below the dormitories, these latrines were often constructed over running water, a diverted stream or an artificial channel engineered to carry away waste. The monks would sit side by side on wooden seats with holes, sometimes separated by thin partitions, other times not at all. Privacy? Not quite. But efficiency? Absolutely. The Rule of St. Benedict, the foundational document for many monastic orders, didn't outline exact wiping techniques, but it did insist on modesty, cleanliness, and discretion. That meant no unnecessary talking, no dawdling, and no using the latrine as a place to gossip or nap. And yes, that had to be stated explicitly, at least once. Monks wiped with cloths, moss, or rags, depending on the season and their monastery's resources. In wealthier abbeys, such as Cluny or Fountains, there were even communal cloths that were cleaned regularly, rotated, rinsed, and dried by assigned lay brothers. Some scholars believe there were even schedules, a sort of who gets which cloth on which day rotation. Imagine the sign-up sheet. But there's more. Some monasteries employed a very practical, very direct invention, the wiping bench. Picture a narrow wooden seat, with a small water trough running beneath and a cloth affixed to a pole. The monk would sit, cleanse with the cloth, then rinse both himself and the fabric in the water. Everything had its place. Everything had its process. Historians still argue whether these cloths were communal or personalised. Some suggest that each monk had his own hygiene kit, kept in a cubby beside his bed, a washing rag, a small pot of herbal rinse, maybe even a chunk of soap, though soap was more for laundry than skin. Others believe cloths were stored near the latrines and changed weekly, like towels at a gym no one ever talks about. And then there's the Friday wash. Many monasteries had a designated day, often Friday, when monks would not only bathe, rarely, but also launder their undergarments and personal cloths. This ritual included inspecting the wiping rags for holes, stains, or excessive wear. There's a surviving inventory list from a 13th century abbey in Burgundy, noting 7 cloths retired from service for thinness and rot. A moment of silence for the fallen. But monks didn't just care about how to wipe, they also worried about when. Timing was essential. In some orders, Bathroom breaks were only allowed before matins, after vespers, or at specific times during the workday. Monks couldn't just sneak off whenever they felt the urge. There were designated toilet hours, and if you broke the rules, you might face penance. One set of monastery regulations from the 12th century warns that any brother caught speaking in the latrine, or worse, laughing, must fast for a day and scrub the entire reredoter floor. And given what happened in that room, that's a punishment both spiritual and aromatic. Then there were the novices. Newcomers to the monastery had to be taught everything: prayer chants, proper robe folding, and yes, bathroom protocol. Some abbeys even assigned a mentor monk to walk a novice through the full hygiene routine, complete with whisper-level commentary and sacred gestures. It was the world's strangest onboarding session. But what if a monk fell ill? Monasteries cared for their own, and infirm monks were often given close stools, portable toilets lined with linen and changed by caretakers. Their rags were cleaned with greater care, and they might receive special herbal rinses, mint, sage, or chamomile, thought to prevent bad vapours. And let's not overlook the spiritual side. Some monks believed that cleanliness, bodily and spiritual, went hand in hand. Wiping wasn't just about comfort, it was about resisting the sins of sloth and impurity. One particularly zealous abbot wrote in his private journal, "Let no man allow filth to linger, lest the devil find purchase upon his flesh." Dramatic, sure, but the man took hygiene seriously. Even the architecture of monasteries reveals this commitment. Abbey blueprints often show lavatoriums, washrooms with basins fed by springs or pipes, and drainage systems carefully engineered to remove waste without contaminating the sacred spaces. The monks weren't just building places to pray, they were building places to go, and go well. Some abbeys even recycled waste. Yes, you heard right. Waste from latrines was sometimes diverted to gardens and used as fertilizer. In places with limited resources, night soil was a precious commodity. And who better to bless the turnips than the brothers who sang to the Lord at dawn? There's an odd kind of poetry in it. So tonight, as you slip into your straw-filled bunk in a silent stone cell, candle guttering low, whispering your final prayer beneath the scent of aged cabbage and lavender oil, imagine this. Tomorrow morning, before the bell tolls for matins, you'll shuffle barefoot down the corridor. You'll nod to Brother Elfric, already waiting in line. You'll take your place on the cool wooden seat above the river-fed trough. You'll wipe, rinse, dry, and return to your day. Clean, quiet, and mildly damp. Because even in a world of strict vows and silent prayer, some needs remain universal. And the monks? They handled it with dignity, design, and a surprising amount of woodwork, revised to full word count. You've wandered the halls of monasteries and crouched behind hedgerows, endured moss, icy rinses, and community sponges. But now, let's turn to something even more haunting. Because as curious and practical as medieval wiping habits were, they were also deeply shaped by one persistent invisible force: fear. Yes, tonight we descend into the quiet paranoia of the outhouse, the dread behind the chamber pot, the whispered prayers uttered while crouching over a wooden board. Because in the medieval imagination, going to the bathroom wasn't just a biological function, it was a spiritually risky maneuver. You're alone, late at night. The fire's died down. The animals have gone quiet. Outside, the wind stirs the grass, and inside, your belly rumbles in that unmistakable way. You grab your cloak, your candle, and something like courage, and you step into the night. Your destination. The small, crooked outhouse behind your home. The one you don't talk about. Because everyone knows you never speak too much about the place. Why? Because to do so might attract attention. The wrong kind of attention. Let's begin with the most infamous myth of all, the demon in the toilet. Yes, really. According to stories preserved in monastic records, religious writings, and folk tales across Europe, It was widely believed that demons could inhabit latrines, chamber pots and cesspits. They didn't live there exactly. They waited there, waiting for your moment of weakness. You were vulnerable, pants down, knees up, soul exposed, and in that moment, evil might strike. One particularly disturbing account from a 13th century abbey in Saxony recounts how a friar, upon settling onto the wooden seat of the reredoter, was met by the red, grinning face of a devil staring up at him from the hole below. The friar fled, reportedly half-wiped, never to use that stall again. To protect themselves, some people carried charms or protective amulets into the toilet. Small crosses carved from bone, tiny pouches of herbs, scraps of scripture or prayers stitched into a linen belt. These weren't fashion statements. They were spiritual armour for the most private of battles. And if you didn't have a charm, you knocked. Yes, even if the latrine was empty, you knocked 3 times before entering. This wasn't just a courtesy in case someone else was inside. It was a warning to spirits. I'm coming in. Leave now. The act of knocking, often 3 times for the Trinity, was believed to startle demons and give them a chance to clear out. Some folks would also spit into the hole before using it, believing the act of spitting banished bad spirits. Others made the sign of the cross or mumbled a verse from Psalms. One popular choice? Psalm 51. Purge me with hyssop and I shall be clean. A verse both literal and metaphorical. In Scandinavian countries, legends warned of outhouse trolls, small creatures who pinched the buttocks of careless users or cursed those who failed to leave offerings. In parts of Bohemia, there was the tale of the straw-haired hag, a faceless woman with dry rustling limbs who reached up from beneath the privy to snatch the unguarded. To avoid her, children were taught to sprinkle ash into the hole before sitting. If it smoked, she was near. If not, you were safe. It sounds absurd now, but remember, before plumbing, before flushes and privacy, the toilet was not a sanctuary. It was a moment of fear. Historians still argue whether these stories were rooted in pre-Christian folklore, Christian theology, or simply the psychological unease of being exposed and alone in the dark. But regardless of origin, the impact was real. These fears shaped architecture, rituals, and daily behaviour. Take the placement of the toilet itself. In many medieval homes, the latrine was built far from the house, not just to control odour, but to keep spiritual filth at bay. The belief was that evil could travel through filth. A haunted latrine too close to home could invite sickness, misfortune, or worse. Even castles and monasteries respected these ideas. Guardrobes were built into outer walls, perched over moats, or isolated in towers, not just for sanitation, but to distance the unclean place from the sacred centre. Monasteries sometimes blessed their latrines before using them, sprinkling holy water on the stones, chanting brief psalms, and invoking divine protection over the wooden seat. And there was more. It wasn't just spirits people feared, it was curses. In several traditions, it was believed that enemies, or even jealous neighbours, could toss cursed items into your toilet to cause harm. A bone, a feather, a clump of your hair. These tokens, once lodged in your waste or water, were thought to bring illness, infertility, or madness. A 14th century French grimoire warns of a root of wormwood placed beneath the bowl that could cause the gut to churn, the face to pale, and the spirit to grow weak. Whether it actually worked is beside the point. People believed it did. To undo these curses, healers would recommend ritual cleansing, washing one's behind with special herbs, reciting prayers backward, or even burning the toilet cloth used during the cursed episode. Better safe than spiritually contaminated. And if your chamber pot broke while you were using it, that was the worst omen. It meant someone was speaking ill of you, spiritually cursing you through gossip. Or worse, that your soul was under attack and your household protections had failed. These cracked pots were never repaired. They were buried or thrown into rivers. Replacing them often involved saying a prayer aloud before the new one's first use. Let this vessel serve my flesh, and leave my spirit untouched. People also feared omen animals in or near the toilet. A black cat sitting on the privy step. A warning. A spider crawling from the chamber pot. An illness was near. A bird flying overhead as you squatted behind a hedge. Death in the family. These weren't superstitions to giggle about. They shaped behaviour. A woman in 15th century Ireland reportedly refused to use her outhouse for 3 days because a raven landed on its roof. And it wasn't just about defending yourself. Sometimes the bathroom was a place to do the harming. Several medieval spellbooks contain instructions for curses that had to be performed while voiding. These included chanting maledictions during defecation, writing the victim's name on a leaf and flushing it into the latrine, or even burying hair near the privy to rot their pride with their waste. Disco. Imagine hexing someone with moss and resolve. But not all toilet superstitions were terrifying. Some were oddly comforting. In parts of Germany, it was considered good luck to wipe with the same hand each day. Breaking the pattern brought misfortune. In some English villages, children were told that leaving bread crust by the outhouse door at night would feed the wiping sprites, small, helpful beings who ensured clean cloths and calm bowels. Honestly, that's the kind of magic we can all get behind. And in the most unexpected places we find humour. Marginalia in medieval manuscripts, the strange little doodles in the margins, sometimes show monks being startled on the privy, or demons fleeing from particularly noxious expulsions. One 14th century illustration features a man squatting while reading a scroll, with the caption, "Even wisdom stinks sometimes." Poetic, if a little pungent. So tonight, as you approach your imaginary outhouse beneath a moonlit sky, candle flickering, amulet in hand, spare cloth tucked beneath your belt, ask yourself, is it just wind rustling the grass? Or is someone, or something, already inside? You knock. Once, twice, 3 times. You wait. And when you enter, you make the sign of the cross, glance into the shadows and whisper a line from Psalm 51, just in case. Because in the medieval world, wiping wasn't just about comfort, it was survival. You faced demons in the latrine, survived straw-haired hags, and knocked 3 times before every visit. But now, let's change the mood. Because not all medieval bathroom stories were dripping with dread. Some of them were downright hilarious. Tonight, we wade into the comedic side of medieval wiping culture. The jokes, the pranks, the mishaps that made people laugh then, and surprisingly still do now. Because if there's one thing that unites the centuries, it's this. Poop jokes never go out of style. You wake up on a feast day morning, stomach already growling in anticipation. There's stew in the hearth, fresh bread on the table, and your uncle has just arrived from the next village with a glint in his eye and a pouch full of mischief. You already know this day will end with someone yelling and someone else blaming the dog. Because yes, latrine humour was absolutely a thing. Let's start with Fabliaux, those cheeky, often bawdy, short poems and stories written in vernacular French. Popular in the 12th and 13th centuries, they were the medieval version of stand-up comedy. Rude, irreverent, and obsessed with bodily functions. In these tales, someone always ends up slipping, squatting, or sitting in something they shouldn't. One particularly infamous story tells of a jealous husband who hides in the privy pit to spy on his wife's suspected lover. When she arrives, she promptly uses the toilet without knowing he's there. The punchline? He emerges covered in filth, shouting about betrayal, only for her to claim he's possessed and call the priest. Classic setup, timeless payoff. Another tale features a man whose chamber pot cracks mid-use, splashing his boots and causing him to slip, tumble out the door, and land backside up in front of the entire village. His wife, instead of helping, throws the pot at him again, this time just out of spite. Medieval theatre also got in on the fun. Farces and Morality plays often used bathroom scenes for physical comedy. Latrine accidents were crowd pleasers. Whether it was a character falling into a cesspit or a bumbling priest getting stuck with his robes caught in a chamber pot, the audience howled. And then there were the pranks. Oh yes, people didn't just tolerate toilet humour, they engineered it. One classic gag involved smearing nettles or hot mustard onto the toilet seat of an unsuspecting victim. The burn would be immediate and the revenge swift. In German markets, boys were known to stuff straw into the holes of public latrines, forcing users to shift awkwardly mid-business, often resulting in hilarious yelps echoing through the stalls. There's even record of fake fart trumpets, made from hollow reeds or pig bladders, used by pranksters to mimic embarrassing sounds from behind privy doors. These devices were so popular at one point that certain towns issued curfews banning latrine noisemakers during Lent. Historians still argue whether such devices were common or more of a novelty, but one thing is clear. If you could make someone laugh while they were trying to wipe, you were halfway to being the village hero, or menace. And then there were the toilet-themed insults. The medieval world was full of creative language, and insults often revolved around bodily functions. Calling someone a privy beast, a guardrobe goblin, or the stain of the chamber pot wasn't just rude, it was performance art. One 14th century letter between rival scribes includes the line, "You're fit only to polish the wood beneath the rumps of monks," which let's admit is an elite tier roast. But not all humour was malicious. Sometimes it was inevitable. People fell into toilets more often than you'd think. Wooden planks rotted, chamber pots cracked, garderobe chutes got icy. There are multiple accounts of nobles, clerics and servants tumbling into their own waste, and, unfortunately, not always surviving. The most infamous case? King Wenceslaus III of Bohemia's chancellor, who in 1383 reportedly slipped while attempting to use the privy during a feast, fell through the rotten seat and drowned in the cesspit below. His death was so ignoble that poets couldn't help but rhyme about it. A life of law and writ ended with a sopping pit. Too soon, even medieval illustrators couldn't resist toilet humour. Monks copying manuscripts often doodled marginalia, those quirky little sketches in the edges of religious texts. Many featured animals doing human things, rabbits jousting, cats baking, and yes, knights pooping. One famous margin drawing shows a nun firing a bow and arrow straight from a chamber pot, her robes fluttering like flags. Beneath it, "For glory waits not for clean hands." Toilet humour, it seems, made it all the way into the holiest of books, and let's not overlook toilet poetry. Yes, really. Poets wrote verses to be hung near the privy. Some were cautionary, "Wipe with care or thou shalt swear." Others motivational, "In cold or heat the seat is sweet," and a few simply told stories. One surviving stanza from an English manor house reads, "Here sits the Lord both great and grim, who ruled the hall from limb to limb, but now he groans with face of woe, for flax is scarce and moss is low." You almost want to embroider it on a towel. Even toilet construction wasn't safe from satire. A Flemish poem from the late 1300s mocks the over-decorated poop chairs of dukes, accusing nobility of spending more on cushions than food. The poet suggests they should eat their linen and wipe with roast duck, since clearly their priorities were inverted. But the jokes weren't limited to the rich. Peasants told their own stories. A favourite trope, someone mistakenly grabbing the wrong cloth. In one tale, a drunken farmhand wipes with a hornet's nest he thought was a rag, and spends the next week singing falsetto for the first time. Another tells of a miserly miller who reused his cloth so many times it disintegrated, mid-wipe, causing a chain reaction of panic, shouting, and one very awkward trip to the riverbank. Some towns even celebrated their local latrine legends. In the Spanish town of Requena, villagers still recount the story of an 11th century shepherd who accidentally invented a bidet by sitting backwards on a water trough. He sat, he slipped, he yelped, and he came out cleaner than he had ever been, the tale goes. They call him El Hombre Limpio, the clean man. Even laws occasionally had a touch of humour. A Bavarian statute from 1442 fined anyone who sang while wiping. as it was considered both indecent and distracting, but the same law added that, should the song be of praise or of useful warning, the fine may be waived. That's right, a toilet jingle could get you out of a ticket. So tonight, as you sit on your imaginary wooden stool beneath a thatched roof, stars twinkling outside, and a suspicious reed whistle tucked into your belt, remember this: for every terrifying latrine demon, there was a gleeful prankster with a mustard rag. For every silent monk with a rosary, there was a farmer composing rhyming couplets about itchy moss. And for every time someone slipped, yelped, or dunked themselves in a cesspit, there were 10 people laughing until they cried, hopefully after they'd wiped. You've chuckled through chamber pot poetry, heard tales of hornet nest mishaps, and nearly applauded for the man who backward bedated his way into legend. But now, dear listener, let's roll up our metaphorical sleeves and get serious, for just a moment. Because all that wiping, rinsing and ritual came with consequences. Tonight, we face the itchy, inflamed, occasionally tragic reality of medieval butt-related health problems. Yes, it's time to talk about the dark side of ditch wipes and reused rags. Let's begin with a visual. You've been wiping with moss for days, maybe weeks. Your tunic is scratchy. You sit on hard benches, ride horseback for hours, and your cloth doesn't exactly get a daily rinse in lavender. It's summer, it's humid. And suddenly you notice a feeling. A burning, a swelling, a suspicious soreness in the worst place possible. Congratulations, you've joined the millions of medieval people who likely suffered from some form of anal discomfort, infection, or irritation long before the invention of ointments, creams, or soothing aloe pads. Because while the tools they used for wiping were creative, many were not particularly sanitary. Straw left splinters, moss could harbour insects. Rags reused without proper washing were breeding grounds for bacteria. And those fancy sponges, the ones Clarence and his gang offered in bathhouses and latrines, when shared, they often passed along more than just a helpful wipe. Let's start with the most likely culprit, hemorrhoids, called piles in medieval texts. These swollen veins plagued peasants and kings alike. The causes were many: straining, malnutrition, dehydration, hours of horseback riding, heavy lifting, and once they appeared, treatments were creative. A 13th century English remedy advised sitting on a warm stone soaked in vinegar and rosewater, followed by gentle dabbing with a soft feather. Another recipe called for ground nettle root mixed with lard, applied in generous measure but with modesty, somehow both helpful and humiliating. In monasteries, herbal remedies were the go-to. Calendula, chamomile and comfrey were mashed into pastes and pressed against inflamed areas. There's even evidence that monks used beeswax suppositories, small waxy cones infused with herbs, inserted to soothe and seal. Think of it as the original medieval butt balm. And then came abscesses. Yes, the dreaded anal fistula, an infected tunnel that could form from untreated sores or infections near the rear. Without antibiotics, these often festered, swelled, and eventually ruptured. Not fun, not rare. The most famous victim? King Henry V of England. Chroniclers report that he suffered from an anal fistula that required surgical intervention. A terrifying concept when you remember that medieval surgery involved no anaesthesia, no sterile gloves, and knives that doubled as eating utensils. The surgeon would make an incision, drain the abscess, and then insert a linen cord called a seton to keep the wound open and draining. Healing could take weeks, and all the while you still had to do your business. Carefully, quietly, painfully. Even everyday folk weren't spared. Rural physicians and midwives often treated such conditions with a mix of bloodletting, hot poultices and prayer. If you lived near a monastery, you might be blessed with better herbs. If not, well, there's always goat dung. Yes, some recipes included goat dung. And the infections didn't stop there. Think about it. If your wiping cloth had been used multiple times, rinsed in a bucket shared by your siblings, and dried in a barn where chickens wandered freely, chances are good it wasn't exactly sterile. Small fissures and tears caused by rough materials or careless wiping could become infected. Symptoms included fever, swelling, redness, and the ever-ominous pain when walking. Treatment? Hot wine compresses, or in extreme cases, leeches applied near the affected area to draw out the poison. I'll give you a moment to digest that. But even the better off weren't safe. In cities, the wealthy had access to fine linens and scented cloths, but they also indulged in heavy rich foods, alcohol, and long hours of sedentary living. That combination often led to constipation, a problem they attempted to fix with enemas. Yes, medieval enemas. Administered using a clyster, a long metal or ceramic tube attached to a bladder or funnel. Enemas were common among nobles and monks. The mixture, usually warm water, salt, oil, and sometimes herbs. The goal, relief, purification, and occasionally penance. In fact, enemas were so popular that professional clysterers existed. These were specialists, often servants or apprentices, whose job it was to prepare, deliver, and clean the device after use. If you're wondering how this was viewed socially, it was awkward but accepted. Like footmen or bath attendants, they performed an essential, if unglamorous, service. Some physicians believed enemas helped rebalance the humours, cleansing the body of black bile and melancholy. Others thought they promoted spiritual clarity, that an empty gut made for a focused mind. And if it happened to soothe a few hemorrhoids along the way, even better. But not all conditions were physical. There were also psychological anxieties around wiping and toilet use. Some people developed what we might now call toilet phobia, rooted in fear of spirits, disease, or social shame. A 14th century diary from a Flemish merchant describes his refusal to use any public privy after witnessing a devil rise from the hole. He insisted on using only fresh moss and carried a personal cloth sealed in beeswax. Whether the story was literal or metaphorical, the anxiety was real, and in communities without access to cloth or fresh water, the risks multiplied. In colder climates, people sometimes wiped with ice or snow, a practice that could cause frostbite in sensitive areas. One Scandinavian folktale describes a farmhand who wiped with ice and was thereafter slow to sit. Not exactly a medical record, but probably not far from the truth. And in desert climates, people use sand, pebbles, or broken pottery. The term ostraca in ancient Greece refers both to voting shards and butt-wiping tiles. These were often reused, which I'm sorry to say didn't help with infection rates. Even something as simple as sitting could be dangerous. Garderobes and latrines, especially poorly maintained ones, were known to collapse. Falling into a cesspit wasn't just disgusting, it was deadly. Multiple records exist of people who drowned or died from exposure to noxious gases. A tragic example. In 1184, at the Erfurt latrine disaster, dozens of nobles died when the floor of the feasting hall, built over a cesspit, collapsed during a meeting. They fell into the filth and suffocated. It's a stark reminder that poor toilet infrastructure wasn't just a nuisance. It could be fatal. So what's the takeaway? For all the jokes, for all the clever tools and improvised rituals, medieval wiping was a risky business. Hygiene wasn't well understood. Germ theory didn't exist. And the best intentioned cloth or moss bundle might bring not relief, but rot. And yet, people kept going. They learned, adapted, shared tips, crafted remedies, whispered warnings, and occasionally wrote poetry about how much it hurt to sit. So tonight, as you lie back, your imaginary chamber pot safely tucked under your bed, your rag cleaned and folded, hopefully, take a moment to feel grateful for soap, for plumbing, for two-ply tissues. Because in the medieval world, a clean bottom was never guaranteed. It was a gamble. You've made it through hemorrhoids, hornet nests, and herbal enemas. Tonight, though, we step outside of Europe. Because while we've spent most of our journey wandering muddy English lanes and candlelit French cloisters, medieval hygiene wasn't just a Western tale. Different parts of the world had entirely different philosophies and tools when it came to cleaning their backsides. And in many cases they were, frankly, way ahead of their European counterparts. So grab your linen travel pouch. Tonight, we journey to the Islamic world, East Asia, and a few surprising corners where butt cleaning was an art. Let's begin in the medieval Middle East, specifically the Islamic Golden Age. You're walking into a hammam, a public bathhouse, one of thousands scattered across cities like Baghdad, Cairo, Damascus, and Cordoba. The tiled floors are warm from underground hypocausts. Aromatic steam curls around marble basins, and in a small alcove just past the rinsing room, you'll find something truly revolutionary: a personal lotta. A lotta is a small handled vessel used to pour water for personal cleansing. In Islamic tradition, cleanliness is not just recommended, it's religiously required. The practice of istinja, or washing after relieving oneself with water, was a cornerstone of daily hygiene. No cloths, no moss, just water and the left hand. And yes, this was done everywhere. Homes, bathhouses, mosques, roadside rest stops. Even travellers carried portable lotas, foldable leather versions they could fill at wells or rivers. In markets, you might find brass or clay models, sometimes beautifully painted, with narrow spouts for careful pouring. And while the left hand did the wiping, the right hand was reserved strictly for eating and social gestures. This hand distinction became so ingrained that to offer someone food with your left hand was seen as a serious offence. Because, well, everyone knew what that hand had been doing. But the innovation didn't stop at water. Medieval Islamic physicians also wrote manuals on hygiene, including entire chapters on toilet practices. Avicenna's Canon of Medicine, one of the most influential medical texts of the Middle Ages, offered guidance on the best posture for defecation, which foods produce softer stools, and how frequently one should clean the anal area to prevent itching and internal heat. Compare that to medieval England's wipe with whatever's near and hope for the best approach. And the contrast is, shall we say, stark. And it wasn't just scholars. The common folk embraced cleanliness too. In wealthier homes, toilet areas were built with drainage systems, simple but effective channels lined with glazed tiles and angled towards street drains. And even in rural areas, people constructed squat toilets with clay water pitchers nearby. This practice of water washing, passed down for centuries, remains common across much of the modern Islamic world today. Now hop on your camel, imagination only please, and let's drift eastward to medieval China. Here, we find yet another step forward: toilet paper. Yes, toilet paper, invented long before Charlemagne ever saw a chamber pot. In the Tang dynasty, 6018-907 CE, there are records of officials using softened sheets of paper for personal hygiene. By the 14th century, during the Yuan and early Ming dynasties, this had evolved into mass production. In one court document from 1393, it's recorded that the imperial court of the Hongwu Emperor ordered over 700,000 sheets of toilet paper for official use. And no, that's not a mistranslation. Even better. The emperor requested a special batch of extra soft, perfumed paper just for himself and his concubines. Each sheet measured about 2 feet by 3 feet, made from bamboo or mulberry pulp, and treated with aloe or camphor. Compare that to Britain's scratchy rags, and you might understand why some travellers describe Chinese hygiene practices with a mix of admiration and envy. But toilet paper wasn't for everyone. In rural villages and farming communities, people often used bamboo spatulas, cloths, or flat stones, then washed with water. In wealthier households, latrines were constructed with water channels, complete with wooden footrests to allow for a squatting posture and cleaner removal. Scholars still argue whether this paper was widespread or limited to elites, but one thing's clear: medieval China had figured out softness and sanitation long before Europe unwrapped its first linen square. Moving farther east, let's glide into medieval Japan, where things got even more refined and sometimes surprising. Here, people often used kawakazura, which were thin sticks made of cypress wood, polished smooth and sometimes carved with personal symbols. Think of them like reusable wiping wands. After use, they were rinsed, dried and stored for next time. In some Buddhist monasteries, each monk had his own toilet wand, kept in a labelled slot near the outhouse. This wasn't just for hygiene, it reflected the Buddhist principle of mindful cleanliness. Bodily functions weren't taboo, they were simply another part of the cycle of care. And yes, toilet paper eventually caught on in Japan too, especially after the widespread influence of Chinese paper culture. But the polished stick remained a staple for centuries, light, effective, and oddly elegant. Even in Southeast Asia, historical records suggest that water washing was the norm. From river communities to jungle villages, people constructed latrine platforms directly over water sources using buckets or gourds to clean afterward. And while these systems weren't always pristine, they reflected an understanding that water, not cloth, was the path to true cleanliness. Contrast all of this with what was happening in Europe. There you had chamber pots shared between families, rags reused until they disintegrated, moss stuffed into hedgerow holes, and nobles scratching their rears with linen scraps between banquets. Meanwhile, emperors were perfuming their paper. But it's not just about tools, it's about philosophy. In the East, cleanliness was deeply entwined with spiritual purity. In Islam, tahara, purity, was required before prayer. In Buddhism, detachment from filth mirrored detachment from worldly suffering. And in Confucian teachings, order and hygiene reflected personal discipline. Whereas in much of medieval Europe, cleanliness was often viewed with suspicion. Too much bathing, too much washing, was believed to open the body to disease or vanity, hence the grim joke that a clean man had either just married or just died. Of course, no system was perfect. Even in places with advanced wiping techniques, access depended on wealth, geography and social class. A rice farmer in southern China didn't have perfumed paper. A Bedouin herder in the desert wiped with smooth stones or sand. And a monk in Kyoto probably still had days where the wiping wand went missing. But overall, the rest of the world had figured out something Europe was still fumbling toward, that wiping is not just a necessity, it's an art. So tonight, as you recline in your imaginary silk robe, a lotta balanced beside you, a scroll of paper fluttering softly in the breeze, remember this. You live in a world where the best ideas often come from the quietest corners, where a polished stick, a simple water vessel, or a perfume paper square can speak volumes about how people live, care, and yes, wipe. And in the grand history of hygiene, Europe, sorry to say, was a little behind. You've crisscrossed continents, cradled a lotta in the bathhouse steam, admired China's perfumed toilet scrolls, and chuckled at monks carefully labelling their wiping sticks. But before we close the lid on this chapter of hygiene history, there's one final curiosity we need to explore. A place where status, etiquette and privacy collided in the most peculiar way. The toilet habits of royalty. Because if anyone in history had the resources to clean their behinds like legends, it was the kings and queens of medieval Europe. But did they? Or did they, like everyone else, crouch awkwardly over planks and hope for a clean leaf? The answer, as always, is wonderfully complicated. Let's start with the basics. You're in a royal court, perhaps English or French, maybe 13th century. Everything is ornate. Gold leaf on the walls, peacocks on the menu, tapestries bigger than your cottage. But somewhere behind all this grandeur, someone still has to go. And that someone just might be the king. Enter the most underappreciated royal servant in all of history, the groom of the stool. Yes, that was the real job title. The groom of the stool was a high-ranking courtier tasked with assisting the monarch during bathroom visits. His duties? Managing the stool, a portable throne with a chamber pot built into it, and ensuring the king was clean, comfortable, and properly wiped. It sounds humiliating, but in fact it was one of the most coveted roles in the royal household. Why? Because it granted unmatched intimacy with the king. In a world where power depended on proximity, if you were the person who helped wipe the royal behind, you were also the person who got to hear secrets, influence decisions, and carry private messages. Some grooms of the stool became political power brokers, others received estates, titles, and lifelong pensions, all for a job that involved quite literally rear-end management. And what about queens? Royal women had their own attendants, ladies-in-waiting, who helped with dressing, bathing and toileting. These women didn't wipe the queen, but they did assist with layered garments, toiletry screens and perfumed cloths. For elite women, privacy wasn't just a luxury, it was a performance. Ladies' stools were often carved from mahogany or cedar, lined with velvet, and equipped with removable chamber pots made of porcelain or silver. These were emptied by specialised servants, usually female, who also cleaned the cloths or linen squares used for wiping. Yes, cloth was king in the royal privy. The nobility used soft, laundered linen squares, sometimes infused with herbs like lavender, rosemary or mint. These cloths were washed in hot water and dried over sweet-smelling coals. They were often monogrammed, stored in carved wooden boxes and delivered on silver trays. Because of course they were. And yes, the wiping was self-administered most of the time. There are a few records suggesting that in cases of illness, pregnancy or old age, nobles were assisted by personal valets or nursemaids who performed cleaning with gentle cloths and herbal rinses. In such cases, modesty took a backseat to practical care. Royalty or not, if you were 80 years old and constipated, you probably welcomed the help. But not all royals had it easy. Let's talk about castles, beautiful from the outside, drafty and uncomfortable on the inside. Most royal castles had guardrobes, stone-walled toilets built into the outer walls. Waste dropped through a vertical shaft, ideally into a moat or cesspit. But here's the catch. These were cold, smelly, and often far from the royal bedroom. So what did the king or queen do in the middle of the night? They used close stools, fancy chamber pots set inside padded boxes, usually topped with embroidered cushions. Some even had warming pans inside to prevent cold seat shock. These stools were kept near the bed and emptied by servants each morning. Think of them as the medieval luxury toilet seat. But not every royal was content with comfort. Some took things to new heights. King Louis XIV of France, for instance, was known to receive courtiers while seated on his toilet. That's right. During the morning levee, when nobles came to pay their respects, Louis would be perched on his golden commode, speaking with advisors while doing his business. For him, toileting was part of royal theatre. Others preferred privacy. Elizabeth I, England's iconic Virgin Queen, had her own private stool room, a chamber off her bedchamber equipped with a cushioned seat, sweet-smelling herbs, and a velvet screen. Her chamber pot was made of pewter, with a lid inscribed with the Tudor rose. And though she had maids for everything, Elizabeth was known to be fiercely independent, insisting on personal control over her hygiene. One court report marvels that she kept her linen cleaner than any laundress might. Still, royalty or not, things could go wrong. Records exist of kings falling from guardrobe seats, of royal pages slipping while carrying chamber pots, and of entire feast halls being evacuated due to privy overflow. One Scottish earl was nicknamed Lord Rushbottom after an unfortunate wardrobe wiping mishap during a hunt. And just because you had fine cloth doesn't mean it worked better. Without modern sanitation, wiping was still a gamble. Scented linen could be reused too long. Herbal rinses might sting. And let's not forget, even royal underpants didn't exist until centuries later. Accidents happened, odours lingered, dignity was relative. Still, there was something to admire in how royalty ritualised their rear-end care. It wasn't just about comfort. It was about ceremony, hierarchy, and the maintenance of image, even in the most human of the moments. The groom of the stool didn't just carry wipes, he carried influence. And those monogrammed cloths, they weren't just fabric, they were statements of power, purity, and the peculiar medieval idea that you could rule the world and still need a really good wipe. So tonight, as you recline on your imaginary four-poster bed, the fire gently crackling, your chamber pot tucked discreetly behind the tapestry, imagine this: a knock at the door. Your most trusted servant enters, bearing a folded square of lavender-scented linen, warm from the hearth, placed reverently upon a golden plate. You nod. They bow. And somewhere, far below the battlements, a humble scribe is noting the event in the daily record. His Majesty wiped at noon. All was well. You followed perfumed cloths through palaces, peeked into velvet-curtained stool rooms, and stood witness to monarchs mid-levee on their royal commodes. But tonight, we move from the elite to those who are largely invisible. Yet without them, no one in the medieval world, rich or poor, could have comfortably gone at all. We're talking about the toilet cleaners, the rag washers, the muck collectors, and the eternally underappreciated gong farmers. If the nobility had grooms of the stool, the rest of society had men and women whose job it was to handle the other end of the business. Literally. Because once that waste left your body, someone had to deal with it. And let's be honest, it wasn't going to be the bishop. Let's begin with the stars of the medieval sanitation world, gong farmers. In medieval England, gong farmers, also known as nightmen or dung collectors, were hired to empty cesspits, latrine shafts and chamber pots. Their name comes from the Old English word gang, meaning to go, so a gong was a place to go. And a gong farmer, the one who cleaned it out. Imagine the scene. It's midnight in a 14th century town. The streets are quiet, the stars are out, and a man with a lantern and 2 wooden buckets sloshes through the alleys, heading toward the back of a tavern. His job? To descend into the pit, shovel out the filth and carry it, by hand, to the city's dumping ground. He's covered head to toe, often in oiled cloth to resist seepage. His tools: a shovel, a rope, and an iron hook. His payment? Modest. His smell? Legendary. Despite the filth, gong farmers were respected, even feared. No one dared cross them. They knew too much. They overheard things, they saw secrets, and their work, while unpleasant, was absolutely essential. Many cities even paid them bonuses to keep working. In London, gong farmers had to live outside city walls. Their waste was dumped in designated fields called lay stalls, where it was sometimes used as fertiliser or left to compost. And yes, the wind direction mattered greatly, but it wasn't just men. Women also worked in waste management, often as laundresses, washerwomen or midwives who assisted with postpartum cleanup. In poorer households, women reused cloths for multiple purposes: wiping children, mopping spills, even bandaging wounds. The line between hygienic and horrifying was often a single rinse away. Laundresses were tasked with cleaning wiping cloths. They carried buckets to rivers, heated kettles, scrubbed cloth on wooden boards with lye soap or ash, and hung everything to dry in smoky kitchens or on hedgerows. The work was endless, and often dangerous. Why dangerous? Because the chemical content of lye, combined with hot water and poor ventilation, caused burns, respiratory issues, and chronic skin conditions. And if the cloths were too soiled, the water turned septic fast. Some washerwomen developed open sores on their hands from constant exposure. Even so, they laboured on. Then there were the privy diggers, men hired to construct or deepen cesspits beneath homes, inns and monasteries. Their job involved digging narrow vertical tunnels beneath latrines, reinforcing the walls with stone or timber, and ensuring the pit didn't collapse under the weight of, well, everything above. It was claustrophobic, it was putrid, and in some cases explosive. Because as medieval waste fermented, it produced methane gas. And when a candle or lantern was introduced, boom. There are accounts of cesspits catching fire, or even detonating, destroying walls and injuring workers. In one infamous case in 1294, a London privy exploded beneath a tavern, killing 2 men and injuring a third. The cause? A poorly vented latrine combined with a drunken torchlight inspection. But what happened to all that waste? Aside from being dumped in lay stalls, it was sometimes recycled. Yes, human waste was valuable. In rural areas, it was mixed with straw and spread over fields. In cities, night soil was sold to farmers or gardeners. The practice wasn't glamorous, but it was effective. Tomatoes weren't a thing yet, but leeks, onions, and cabbage thrived on it. There were even laws about waste. Some towns required homeowners to hire gong farmers at least once a month. Others imposed fines if chamber pots were found overflowing or thrown from windows without warning. You might get away with yelling "Gare des Lots" in Paris, but in Bruges, that earned you a penalty and a stern lecture from the sanitation officer. Historians still argue whether these laws were enforced or simply aspirational. Either way, the people doing the work, hauling waste, scrubbing cloths, digging pits, were the silent heroes of medieval cleanliness, and their social standing. Complicated. Gong farmers were often ostracised. They lived in separate quarters. They weren't invited to church feasts or weddings. Children whispered about them. But if your chamber pot overflowed, or your garderobe backed up, they became your best friend. There's even a recorded case of a noblewoman gifting a gong farmer a pair of silk gloves, not to wear, but as a symbolic thank you. Because as she put it, he keeps the stink from the garden and the shame from the hall. Some enterprising gong farmers rose through the ranks. A few bought land, hired crews, and built waste-hauling businesses. In cities like Florence and Bruges, waste contracts were auctioned publicly, and the highest bidder got exclusive rights to collect and sell the soil. It was dirty work, but profitable. Let's not forget the rag traders. Wiping cloths, once too threadbare or stained to reuse, were often sold to ragmen, traders who bought old fabric and sold it to paper makers. That's right. In a strange twist of fate, some medieval toilet cloths eventually became paper, used for everything from legal documents to love letters. So tonight, as you lie back with your freshly scrubbed imagination, clean linens and well-ventilated bathroom, remember this. Behind every noble wiping his perfume behind with monogrammed linen, there stood a laundress scrubbing quietly in the fog. Behind every princess on her velvet commode, a servant rinsing cloths by moonlight, and beneath every castle tower, a gong farmer with a shovel, a rope, and a nose of steel, ready to do the work no one else would. Because in the medieval world, wiping wasn't just personal, it was a public operation. You followed the unsung heroes of hygiene into the bowels of medieval society, lifted the lid on royal chamber pots, and peeked into the soot-streaked laundries of rag washers and night soil men. But tonight, let's turn our gaze to an entirely different arena, where ideas, not odours, reigned supreme. Because in medieval times, not everyone agreed on how, or even if, you should wipe at all. Welcome to the curious, occasionally heated world of philosophical hygiene debates. Yes, people argued about wiping. And no, these weren't drunken tavern brawls about whether moss or straw worked better. These were debates held by theologians, physicians and scholars, the intellectuals of the day, who wrote treatises, essays and letters pondering everything from sanitation to salvation. Let's begin with one of the most central medieval beliefs, that the body and soul were intertwined, and so, how you treated your body, especially in private moments, could affect your moral standing. Enter the question, is wiping an act of vanity? Some ascetics believed so. In monastic communities, particularly among the more severe orders, it was argued that wiping excessively, or with soft-scented cloths, was a sign of weakness, indulgence. A pampered body led to a pampered soul. Better, they said, to embrace discomfort, to let the sting remind you of your humility. One 11th century monk wrote in his journal, "To wipe with thistle and endure is to know Christ in suffering." Another noted that softness was the gateway of pride, and that even rags should be used sparingly. Meanwhile, others countered that proper hygiene was a spiritual discipline. Cleanliness kept the mind focused. A clean body allowed one to pray without distraction, without shame. In some monastic rules, specific sections outline the just and modest way to cleanse oneself, suggesting neither overindulgence nor neglect. Historians still argue whether these practices were widespread or limited to particularly zealous communities. But the debate reveals something important. Even toileting was theological. Outside monasteries, medical theory got involved. Remember, the medieval world revolved around the four humours: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. Health depended on balancing these fluids, and so physicians believed that stool had to be expelled regularly to maintain balance. But how you cleaned up afterward? That was more controversial. Some medical writers insisted on wiping with cooling herbs, mint, rose petals, or violet, believing they soothed the excess heat of yellow bile. Others warned against too much wiping, claiming it could chafe the skin and cause humoral imbalance, particularly in children and the elderly. The 12th century Arab physician Ibn al-Jazar wrote in Zad al-Musafir that overwiping could cause inflammation, while insufficient wiping led to dampness of the humours and melancholy. His solution? A gentle cloth rinsed with rose water, followed by a dab of sesame oil. It wasn't just scholars, though. Everyday people had folk wisdom, passed down in proverbs and home remedies. Wipe with nettle, wake the devil. Twice for luck, thrice for sin. Better dirty cloth than dirty conscience. These sayings weren't just jokes. They reflected moral anxieties about the body, how much attention one should pay to it, what kind of wiping was dignified, and whether dirtiness was a sign of poverty or piety. Even literature joined in. In Dante's Inferno, the depiction of hell includes sinners immersed in filth, their shame manifest in waste. Scholars later debated whether this imagery was metaphorical or literal. Some believed Dante intended to critique excessive bodily pride. Others thought it was just a very poetic way of saying, hell stinks. Meanwhile, Geoffrey Chaucer, in the Canterbury Tales, used bathroom humour to reveal class distinctions. The more a character fussed over their toilet routine, the more likely they were to be vain, wealthy, or hypocritical. One pilgrim, described as having a kerchief fair and neat to clean her every seat, is later mocked for her selfishness. But perhaps the strangest debate came from early printing culture. When books became more widely available and paper more affordable, people started using discarded pages as toilet paper. Yes, manuscript scraps, unused pamphlets, misprinted folios, even religious tracts were repurposed in privies. This created a moral panic. Should holy words ever be used to wipe? Some priests thundered from pulpits, "Woe to the man who cleanses his rear with the word of God." Others, more practical, shrugged, "Better the page be used than wasted." In one German town, a law was passed banning the use of scripture or legal decrees in latrines, on pain of excommunication or a hefty fine. There's a surviving letter from a bishop in the late 1400s, lamenting the use of psalm verses as toilet liners, writing, "What once inspired tears of devotion now wipes tears of digestion." And then there were the satirists, writers who mocked the entire hygiene culture of the age. They pointed fingers at nobles who wiped with lace, at monks who debated the correct angle of approach, at apothecaries who sold overpriced wiping herbs. One play features a character boasting that he wipes with cloth kissed by angels and soaked in moonlight, only to slip and fall into a dung cart moments later. Even politics found its way in. During the 100 Years' War, anti-French propaganda in England included pamphlets claiming that the French wipe with lace, but never wipe at all. The implication: effete, overindulgent, soft. In turn, French writers mocked the English as moss-bottomed brutes who stank of sheep and shame. It was petty, it was crude, and it worked. Because wiping, as it turns out, is deeply personal, and therefore deeply political. So tonight, as you lie beneath your covers, pillow fluffed, and moonlight peeking through your window, take a moment to consider. Somewhere, centuries ago, a monk argued with his brother about whether lavender water or rose oil made for a more penitent wipe. A physician warned a nobleman to avoid rough linen lest it disturb his phlegm. A scholar gasped in horror as someone used a misprinted psalm as a napkin, and a peasant woman rolled her eyes and said, "Just use the moss and get on with it." Because in the grand sweep of medieval hygiene, it wasn't just what you used, it was what it said about you. You've sat through scripture wiping scandals, endured debates on lavender versus rose oil, and heard monks argue over the humility of moss. But now, let's explore the space where culture met practicality, the customs, taboos, and unwritten rules that governed how medieval people wiped, where they wiped, and who got to wipe with what. Because in a world without Charmin, the wiping rules weren't just about what was available, they were about identity. Let's start with class. In medieval society, your status shaped not only your meals and your bed, but also your bathroom experience. Nobles, as we've seen, wiped with fine linens, perfumed cloths, and even silk scraps stitched with silver thread. But what about the rest? If you were a peasant, you used what you could reach. Moss if you lived near woods, hay if you had livestock, smooth pebbles if the river hadn't frozen over. In the colder months, snow was a brutal but effective option. If you were lucky, you might own a dedicated wiping cloth, but more often you wiped with something that would be burned, buried, or thrown into the pig trough. There was even a kind of social prestige in not needing to wipe. Monks in certain orders boasted of eliminating with such cleanliness and frequency that wiping was unnecessary. Others believed minimal wiping kept the soul from becoming too attached to worldly comfort. Historians still argue whether this claim was bravado, spiritual metaphor, or wishful thinking, but the idea of pure passage was an aspiration in some cloisters, and wiping wasn't just about class, it was about gender. In many cultures, men and women had separate spaces to relieve themselves, and correspondingly different tools. Women, especially those in childbirth or menstruation, often had access to cloths soaked in herbal infusions, believed to reduce inflammation and prevent infection. Midwives carried bundles of these cloths, sometimes scented with myrrh, sage, or marjoram, and often used them to assist with postpartum wiping. In wealthier homes, postpartum women were churched, cleansed in both a spiritual and physical sense, through rituals that included bathing, oiling, and careful wiping. Men, by contrast, were often more utilitarian in their approach. Hunters might carry wiping leaves tucked into belts. Knights, believe it or not, sometimes wiped inside their armour, using cloth bands attached to undergarments. These cloths were replaced nightly, or during battle not at all. Then there was age. Children were trained in wiping as soon as they were weaned. Mothers taught them to recognise clean versus unclean areas of moss, or to use the smoother side of a leaf. In some cultures, children were not trusted with cloths at first. They were given sticks or flat wood chips to scrape and flick. It was practical. It was traumatising. Elders, on the other hand, were often assisted. In many households, wiping an ageing parent wasn't seen as gross. It was a sacred duty. Filial piety, especially in Eastern traditions, meant caring for every aspect of your elder's well-being, including hygiene. In England and France, such assistance usually fell to the youngest daughter or a household servant. In monasteries, older monks were assigned young novices, whose tasks included bathing and wiping the infirm. It was considered an act of humility and service. But let's talk about regional quirks. In Ireland, some folk believed wiping with peat moss was best, not only for its softness, but because it had earth-drawing power, meaning it cleansed not just the flesh but the aura. Peat was burned after use, not buried to send the impurity into smoke. In parts of Italy, olive branches were favoured, soft, pliable and plentiful. In times of drought, even dried grape skins were used, pressed between cloth, or simply clutched and tossed. In Norway, fish scales were reportedly used by coastal communities, scraped from leftover filleting piles and bundled in cloth. Apparently, they offered just the right combination of abrasion and glide. We'll take their word for it. And in the Balkans, sheep's wool was considered the pinnacle of peasant luxury. A tuft of clean wool, carefully cleaned and kept in a pouch, could last a family several days. It was soft, absorbent, and could be burned afterward, pure and ash-free. Every region had a best leaf too. Elder leaves were soft but bitter-smelling. Plantain was smooth and flexible. Mulberry was prized in China. And beware the stinging nettle, which, as every village boy learned once, was not for wiping. Etiquette also played a major role. You didn't talk about wiping in polite company, unless, of course, you were trying to insult someone. One common insult among medieval Germans was, "he who wipes with bread," suggesting wastefulness, stupidity, or excess. At dinner tables, wiping talk was strictly forbidden. A child caught discussing toilet habits at supper might be sent outside for the evening, or worse, assigned to latrine cleaning for a week. Yet, ironically, latrine jokes were wildly popular after a few ales at the tavern. It was all about timing. Even storage was political. Some people kept their wiping cloths near the hearth, believing the smoke would cleanse the cloth. Others stored them in sealed jars with crushed rosemary. In wealthier homes, the cloths were hung on pegs near the bed or inside a wooden toilet chest, essentially a medieval version of a bathroom cabinet. And if you were a guest, you were expected to bring your own cloth. Failing to do so was deeply shameful, akin to showing up without pants. In some regions, innkeepers kept a stash of guest cloths, but these were usually scratchy, worn, and slightly damp. Not ideal. One traveller's journal from 1437 recounts being mocked at a tavern for asking where the cloths were kept. The innkeeper responded, "The lord who seeks a wipe must bring his own dignity." The ultimate takeaway? Wiping, for all its earthy utility, was steeped in meaning. It revealed your class, faith, family role, regional pride, and personal habits. It was one of the few actions every single human had in common, yet no two people did quite the same way. So tonight, as you sit on your imagined wooden seat, beneath your thatched roof, wiping cloth in hand, ask yourself, would you reach for moss or wool? Would you fold or crumple? Would you burn the cloth or boil it for reuse? Because in the medieval world, how you wiped wasn't just practical. It was who you were. You folded your moss with dignity, weighed the ethics of grape skins, and debated whether wiping with bread made you wasteful or just really, really confused. But tonight, we leave the bodily and step into the symbolic, into the dreamlike world of rituals, myths, and folklore where wiping transcended flesh and became something more. Because believe it or not, in the Middle Ages, wiping wasn't just a necessity. It could be a ritual, a spell, a test, or even a metaphor for the soul. Let's begin with something simple: blessings. In some villages, particularly in rural France and the Rhineland, people began their day with a whispered phrase before wiping. "May this filth leave my body and not my spirit." It was part charm, part prayer, an everyday attempt to keep the soul clean even as the body did what it must. Children were taught a rhyme: clean the tail, cleanse the tongue. Words and waste both must be flung. It was believed that truthfulness and bodily hygiene went hand in hand. A lying child might be said to have wiped with crooked moss, meaning they'd done a job poorly, physically and morally. And then there were superstitions. In Slavic folklore, it was believed that throwing used wiping cloths into running water would carry away bad dreams. If you buried them near a crossroad, you might trap a spirit. If you burned them with rosemary, you could bless a home against illness. Historians still argue whether these rituals were rooted in pre-Christian purification rites, or were simply ways to cope with poor sanitation. Either way, they imbued wiping with weight, turning a necessary act into a kind of everyday magic. In some regions of Wales and Cornwall, the cloth itself became a talisman. A wiping cloth used by a beloved grandmother, washed and stored, might be passed down as a protective charm for childbirth. Hung near the bed, it was said to guard the baby from illness by the force of clean blood. Yes, this sounds bizarre, but remember, before medicine, before hygiene manuals, protection came through symbol and belief, and wiping, intimate, universal and unspoken, was a powerful vessel for both. Let's talk about divination. In a few obscure folk tales from Hungary and the Balkans, it was said that the shape of your waist could predict your future. And yes, how you wiped played a role too. If the cloth came away clean on the first try, your week would be smooth. If it took 2 or more, expect trouble. If you had to reach for a second moss bundle, someone was thinking ill of you. In some Romani traditions, women would inspect their wiping cloths after the birth of a child. If blood marked the edge in a perfect circle, it was considered a sign the baby would be a singer or poet. If the mark was ragged or spread, the child would be stubborn, wild, or fated for wandering. To us it might sound strange, almost comedic. But to them, it was the body speaking in symbols. Some midwives in Bohemia even read the folds of soiled cloths like tea leaves, interpreting streaks and smears like omens. One particularly dramatic tale tells of a woman who refused to marry a suitor after her wiping cloth showed the shape of a falling tree. The tree, she said, was his health. He died 3 months later. Cue dramatic music. Then there were the folk stories, little parables, often whispered to children by candlelight. One from Iceland tells of a troll named Krubik, who punished selfish children by swapping their soft wiping cloths for fish skin in the night. The only way to get the cloth back: share your lunch with a hungry neighbour. Krubik was weirdly moralistic. Another tale from the Pyrenees involves a mountain spirit who visited lonely shepherds and offered them a choice: wipe with gold but never sleep peacefully, or wipe with thistle and dream of paradise. Most chose the thistle. And in the German Black Forest there's a legend of a clean ghost, a woman in white who appeared only to the most hygienic villagers and whispered secrets of health and long life. Children who wiped thoroughly were said to hear her singing in the wind. Even wiping techniques were mythologized. In certain Baltic communities, wiping front to back wasn't just about hygiene, it was symbolic. Backward wiping was thought to undo luck, while forward wiping brought hope toward the sunrise. This is admittedly not practical advice, but again, it wasn't just about the body, it was about ritual intention. And let's not forget the seasonal beliefs. In some alpine villages, wiping during the harvest moon was said to improve fertility. Cloths used on the night of the first frost were buried beneath orchards to bless the fruit trees. And wiping on Christmas Eve with cloths washed in church water was thought to purify the soul. These rites were rarely official. The church, in fact, often condemned them as superstition. But people did them anyway, because even in silence, people craved meaning. And wiping. That was as close to the bone of life as anything could be. Even poets got in on the act. A 15th century Welsh bard wrote, "What is the soul but the cloth of the mind, stained with thought and wrung out behind?" A French mystic scribbled in the margins of his diary, "I wipe with intention. As I cleanse the rear, may my sins follow the cloth." And in the most poignant example, a dying monk in Bavaria left a single line in his journal: "I have eaten, I have wiped, I am clean, I go now." It was, in a way, a final absolution. So tonight, as the candles flicker low and the breeze ruffles the edge of your blanket, picture this: a quiet ritual. A cloth folded with care. A moment of stillness where the body, the soul, and the very act of living align. Because in the medieval world, wiping wasn't just the end of a process. It was a prayer. You followed moss bundles through forests of folklore, deciphered ghost wiper omens, and folded silk squares under the judgmental eyes of monks and mystics. But now, dear listener, we reach the end. One last wipe, one final cloth laid gently to rest. Tonight, we ask, what did the end of wiping look like in the medieval world? Not the end of the act, but the slow, quiet shift from old ways into new ones. Because even in the Middle Ages, change was always rustling just beyond the hedgerow. Let's start with a scene. It's the late 15th century. You're a young apprentice in a growing European city, maybe London, Bruges, or Florence. The streets are busier now. Trade routes thrum with goods from far-off places, and nestled between wool merchants and spice traders is a curious new shop, the paper seller. Paper's no longer exotic. It's becoming cheaper, thanks to advances in mills and presses. Suddenly you see it everywhere. Wrapping fish, copying sermons, lining drawers, and yes, sitting folded beside chamber pots. At first it feels wasteful to use. People mutter that cloth is softer, moss more natural, but slowly, discreetly, paper takes hold. Inns begin offering it to travellers, merchants fold scraps into neat bundles for guests, and eventually entire rolls are hung by string in wealthier homes. Of course, it wasn't soft. Not yet. This wasn't quilted, aloe-kissed luxury. It was coarse, unbleached, sometimes with wood splinters still clinging to the fibres, but it was disposable, burnable, symbolic of a shift toward modern sanitation. And that shift didn't stop with wiping. Across cities, sewer systems began to evolve. In places like Paris and Milan, waste management became a public concern, not just a private one. Cesspits were replaced with pipes. Chamber pots were gradually phased out in favour of indoor commodes. In homes of the rising middle class, the idea of filth changed. What had once been natural, clothes soiled with daily life, chamber pots emptied at dusk, became shameful. Cleanliness became a virtue not of humility, but of aspiration. And with that, wiping changed too. People now wanted cleaner cloths, single-use items, even scented rinses. Apothecaries offered hygiene waters, infused with thyme or citrus. The wealthier citizens commissioned bidet-like wash basins, and yes, some even began experimenting with flushable devices, early ancestors to the toilet. But it wasn't just about technology, it was about belief. The plague had come and gone, and returned. People began to link disease with filth, not sin. This shift, from spiritual to scientific, redefined hygiene as a matter of health, not just morality. Still, the transition was uneven. In rural villages, moss was used well into the 1700s. In mountain regions, wiping stones were passed down like heirlooms. In monasteries, cloths were still boiled, folded, and stacked with reverence. Even as modern ideas crept in, the old ways lingered. And in that overlap, in that quiet, intimate space between cloth and skin, there was memory. Of mothers teaching children to fold moss with care. Of monks whispering psalms as they wiped. Of nobles reclining on cushioned stools, lifting a bell for their servant. Of farmers squatting behind hedgerows, a bundle of hay in one hand and a hopeful glance at the sky. These weren't just habits, they were rituals of being alive, and while the tools changed, paper for moss, porcelain for wood, plumbing for buckets, the need remained the same. The universal truth no king or beggar could escape. When the time came, we all had to go, and after we went, we all had to wipe. So tonight, as the last ember fades and your pillow softens beneath your cheek, remember this. The story of medieval wiping isn't one of disgust, it's one of ingenuity, of survival, of people making do, finding comfort, and caring for themselves and each other in a world without toilet paper or taps. Because in the quiet corners of history, where no chronicler thought to write, there lived 1,000 tiny acts of dignity, and that's worth honouring, even now. Word count was as 403. And so, as the flicker of candlelight dims in your mind's eye, and the last echoes of chamber pots fade into gentle silence, take a long, slow breath. Let the weight of moss, cloth and centuries drift away. You've wandered through muddy fields, ducked into dim garderobes, smelled the bitter scent of lavender on boiled linen. You've walked in the sandals of monks and peasants, held the royal wiping cloth of kings, and crouched beside riverbanks under starlight, wiping with whatever the land provided. Let it go. The straw, the stone, the silence of servants, the whisper of winding cloths. Let your body grow still. Inhale the softness of clean hay. Feel the warmth of hearth-heated cloth wrapped gently around you. Listen to the hush of monks chanting in the next room. Feel the cool, worn wood beneath you, smooth from generations of use. It's quiet now. No more rags to scrub. No more moss to gather. No more worry about nettles hiding in the dark. You're safe. You're clean. You're exactly where you need to be. Wrapped in blankets, tucked in with knowledge, rocked to sleep by the most unexpected story in history. A story that, though humble, bound people together across time, place, and class. Because everyone, in the end, just wanted to feel clean. Sleep well, traveller of time, you've earned it. End of story. Sweet dreams.